Hey everyone, welcome back to Stories for Sleep. I know a lot of you listen to these stories to help you relax and drift off to sleep. But before you close your eyes, I have a little favor to ask. If you can, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. It's always fun to see how many places around the world we're connecting with. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new one. Now, it's time to get comfy and relax. Let's forget about everything for a moment and enjoy tonight's story together. Ready? Let's begin. The night was thick with fog, the kind that crept in and swallowed everything whole. Jack couldn't remember the last time he'd seen the stars, or the moon for that matter. All he knew was that the chill in the air gnawed at him, creeping under his jacket and making him wish he'd dressed warmer before leaving the office. The city streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional sound of distant traffic that seemed to come from a world away. It was well past midnight, and he had just missed the last bus of the night. His phone had died hours ago, a victim of the endless emails and calls he'd received in a final flurry of activity before leaving the office. He should have known better. He should have charged it earlier, or at least carried a portable charger. But no. Now here he was, stranded in the dark, staring down an empty bus stop with the dim glow of a street lamp casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. There was something unsettling about the way the streetlights flickered. It wasn't a casual, lazy flicker you'd expect from an old bulb. No, these lights seemed to pulse, as though they were struggling to stay alive, pushing against something unseen. Every now and then, a gust of wind would rattle the nearby trees, and the distant hum of the city would briefly fade into an unnerving silence. Jack looked down at his watch. It was already 12:37 a.m. "Great," he muttered to himself, checking his phone once more. Still no signal. He had been in this part of town many times before, too many times probably, but tonight something felt different. The air felt thick, saturated with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. It wasn't the kind of fear that made your heart race or your hands shake. No, it was the quiet kind of terror that crept in slow, like the shadows at the edges of your vision. The kind of fear that made you second-guess every choice you'd ever made, every step you'd taken to get to this moment. Just as Jack was about to start pacing back and forth, his eyes fell upon the old train station in the distance. It wasn't much of a station, really, more of a relic from a bygone era. The station's lights were dim, casting long stretches of darkness between them. Yet there was something oddly inviting about it. The trains were supposed to be long gone at this hour, but maybe, just maybe, there would be a late-night ride out of this town. Maybe he could make his way home on the tracks instead. Without thinking, he began walking toward it, his footsteps echoing unnervingly loud in the otherwise quiet night. The pavement beneath his shoes cracked and groaned, the sound carrying in the stillness like a warning. Jack didn't even notice when the fog seemed to grow thicker, rolling in from all sides and swallowing up the street, the buildings, even the sky above him. It wasn't natural, this fog. He had lived here long enough to know that. But, like the flickering streetlights, it was hard to place, just something that didn't belong. As he reached the entrance of the station, he could feel his breath coming a little faster, but not because of the cold. No, it was something else, an instinctual shiver that had nothing to do with temperature. The station was abandoned, just as expected. The sign above the platform read, "Last train 12:45, and the old ticket booth was covered in a thick layer of dust. Not a soul in sight. He glanced around, a faint sense of relief crossing over him for a brief moment, until he noticed the faint glow of light spilling from the doors of one of the trains on the far side of the station. Jack frowned. The trains didn't come this late. Not on a weeknight. Curiosity gnawed at him. He wasn't a stranger to a late-night ride now and then, but there was something about this train, the way the lights flickered inside, that felt wrong. Too isolated, too still. But the fog had a way of pulling you in, of luring you into things you'd usually avoid. Without another thought, Jack stepped closer. The door of the train silently creaking open as if it were expecting him. No attendant, no announcements, nothing at all. He hesitated. Should he go inside? Should he just turn around and leave? He stood there, frozen in indecision for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then the train moved. The slight jolt of motion snapped him out of his trance, and before he could process what was happening, Jack found himself stepping onto the train. The door closed behind him with a soft hiss, and the train began moving slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. He glanced out the window and saw the station's platform slowly disappearing behind him, swallowed by the fog. There was no turning back now. Inside the train, the air smelled stale, like something had been left in the dark for far too long. There were no other passengers, just empty seats, stretching down the aisle in both directions. The faint hum of the train's engine was the only sound, a rhythmic thrum that felt almost comforting. And yet it didn't sit right. Something was off. Jack sat in one of the empty seats, his heart still racing from the strange encounter at the station. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to shake off the strange feeling of dread that hung over him. His eyes scanned the interior, noting the worn seats and faded carpeting. The dim lighting gave everything an odd, sepia-toned hue, like a place frozen in time. But there was no one else on the train, not even a conductor. It was as if the entire train was waiting for something, or someone. He tried to push the unsettling thoughts out of his mind. Maybe this was just an old train stuck on some sort of late-night schedule, running through the night like some kind of forgotten relic. Maybe he could catch a ride to the next town over and figure out what to do. But the longer he sat there, the more he felt like the train was too quiet. The kind of silence that wasn't natural. Jack leaned forward, peering through the window to see nothing but thick, rolling fog. No streetlights, no sign of life, just endless darkness stretching ahead of them. "Where the hell am I going?" he muttered, barely above a whisper. He glanced up, his eyes catching something, or rather someone, in the reflection of the window. A figure standing at the far end of the train. He could just make out the shape of a man, tall and thin, dressed in a long dark coat. But there was no sound of footsteps, no movement. Just a figure, standing completely still. Jack's breath caught in his throat, but before he could react, the figure disappeared. It was like it had never been there at all. He blinked, staring at the spot where it had stood, trying to convince himself that it was just his imagination. But deep down, he knew better. The train continued its slow journey, its wheels creaking on the tracks. It was only then, in the eerie stillness of the night, that Jack began to wonder whether this train was even heading in the direction he thought it was. And if it wasn't, was there any way to get off? The train hummed, and the darkness outside the window seemed to press against the glass with a cold, oppressive weight. Jack's heart was still thumping in his chest, louder now, almost in time with the rhythmic clatter of the train's wheels on the tracks. But as the figure in the corner of the train disappeared, an odd calm washed over him. He'd seen strange things before, nothing that couldn't be explained by exhaustion or too much stress. Right? He swallowed hard, trying to calm his nerves. The old train station, the fog, it was all just part of the night, part of being in a city that didn't sleep. He'd been under too much pressure at work lately. Maybe this would be a good time to just close his eyes and rest. After all, what harm was there in that? But just as he was about to lean back into the seat, a noise cut through the silence. At first, it was faint, so faint he thought it might have been the sound of his own heartbeat. But then it came again, a soft shuffle, like the sound of someone dragging their feet across the old, worn carpet. He froze, listening intently. Was someone else on the train? Had he missed them when he first boarded? He glanced down the aisle toward the far end of the car. There was still no one there. He squinted, as if trying to convince himself that the dark spaces between the rows of seats were just shadows, nothing more. But then, as his eyes adjusted, he saw them. Just at the far end of the car, near the window, a pair of eyes glinted in the dim light. Eyes that were too wide, too round. They were staring directly at him. And there was something unnatural about them, something that made his stomach churn. The eyes blinked slowly, and then the face they belonged to emerged from the shadows. It was the figure, the man in the long coat, but now Jack could see him clearly, and he felt the first true shiver of fear creep up his spine. The man didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, looking at Jack with that same unsettling gaze. Jack opened his mouth to say something, to ask who the man was, or where they were headed, but his voice caught in his throat. It was as though he couldn't form the words. And that feeling of dread, that sense that something was terribly wrong, deepened. The man wasn't alone. As Jack's eyes swept across the train, he realized the other passengers, who hadn't been there before, were starting to come into view. At first, it was just a glimpse, a face half hidden in shadow, a pair of hands, white-knuckled and gripping the edge of a seat. There were so many of them all scattered throughout the car, as though they had always been there, waiting in silence. They didn't move, they didn't speak, they just watched. And they were all staring at him. His breath quickened, and he looked frantically for an escape. But the doors were locked. The windows, too, offered no solace. All he could do was sit there, staring back at the faces that slowly began to come into clearer focus. There was a man who sat in the row behind him. His eyes were dark, so dark they looked almost empty. The kind of eyes you only saw in people who had forgotten how to smile, how to laugh, how to feel. The man's face was gaunt, his skin pale, almost sickly, like a corpse freshly exhumed. Across from him, a woman sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her fingers twitched, tapping an erratic rhythm on the armrest. Her eyes, too, were wide, unblinking, unseeing. Her lips were pressed together in a thin line, as though she were suppressing something that wanted to spill out. But what? What could it be? And then there were the others. They were everywhere, stretching down the car, filling the seats, each more disconcerting than the last. Some of them had faces that were too still, their expressions frozen, as though they had been carved out of stone. Others had faces that were strangely blurred, as if Jack couldn't focus on them for too long. His eyes kept sliding off their features, unable to capture them fully. But the worst part was the silence, the deep, oppressive silence that hung between them all. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as though time itself had stopped, trapped inside this train, this coffin on wheels. A cold sweat broke out on Jack's forehead, and he wiped his brow with trembling hands. What was this? Where was he going? Why had he gotten on this train in the first place? "Excuse me," he finally said, his voice shaking, breaking the stillness. "Where are we going?" There was no answer. No one even looked at him. The passengers simply continued to sit, their eyes fixed on him, never blinking. And then, almost imperceptibly, the train began to pick up speed. Slowly at first, but the jolt of acceleration pressed Jack deeper into his seat. He looked out the window, half expecting to see the familiar lights of the city or the dark outlines of buildings passing by. But the fog had thickened, and now there was nothing but the inky blackness of the night, stretching on forever. The train moved faster, slicing through the void, but there was no sound of wind, no rattle of air against the windows. It was as if the train were traveling through a tunnel, but there was no tunnel. And then he saw it, or rather, he didn't see it. There, in the distance, beyond the fog, beyond the darkness, a faint glow began to emerge. It was barely visible at first, but as the train gained speed, the glow grew brighter. Jack blinked, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it a light, fire, or something else entirely? But before he could focus on it, the train jolted again, this time so violently that Jack was thrown forward in his seat. The strange passengers remained still, as if nothing had happened, as if they weren't even human. The lights in the car flickered, casting everything in stuttering shadows. And in that brief moment of darkness, Jack felt it, a cold, creeping sensation running down his spine. It wasn't the fog that chilled him. It wasn't the speed of the train or the strange passengers. No, it was something far worse. It was the realization that the train was not just moving through space. It was moving through time, and it was taking him somewhere he wasn't sure he could escape from. The distant light was closer now. He could almost hear it. It was drawing him in. The others didn't seem to notice, didn't seem to care. But Jack did. And every fiber of his being screamed that this train was not just headed toward a place, but toward an end. Jack's chest tightened as he stared out the window, his heart beating erratically in his chest. The glowing light in the distance had grown brighter now, more distinct, as though it were drawing him in, pulling him toward it. It had a strange, almost magnetic quality, as if the very force of its presence had the power to drag him closer, whether he wanted to go or not. And something told him he did not want to go. But what choice did he have? The train was speeding faster now, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks louder, as if the wheels were urging him toward something, some destination he couldn't comprehend, one that was both terrifying and inevitable. He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust, trying to steady his breathing. Around him, the passengers still sat motionless, their eyes fixed on him, unwavering. Not a word, not a movement, just silent, hollow stares that seemed to pierce through the darkness like knives. Jack looked back out the window again, and the light was even closer now. It pulsed as though it were alive, throbbing in time with his heart. His pulse quickened, and a cold sweat broke out across his brow. Something wasn't right. It felt as though the very air in the train car had thickened, weighed down by an unseen pressure that pressed in on him from all sides. And then a voice, soft, almost imperceptible, whispered from the darkness. It wasn't a word he could understand. It wasn't even a language he recognized, but it was a voice, one that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the train, from the very walls themselves. It was a voice that had been there all along, waiting for him to hear it. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if the voice was real, or if it was just a product of his mounting terror. He looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The strange passengers were as still as ever, their eyes never leaving him, their faces cold and expressionless. The voice came again, louder this time, though still muffled, as though spoken from the depths of the train's engine. It was almost a growl now, low and guttural. The sound sent a shiver through Jack's bones, a primal fear that went beyond reason. He leaned forward, his eyes searching the dark corners of the car, trying to identify where the sound was coming from. Suddenly the lights flickered again and the train shook with a violent lurch. Jack was thrown forward, his body slamming into the seat in front of him, but when he tried to steady himself, his hand brushed against something cold, something alive. He whipped his head around, but nothing was there. Nothing, except the shadows. The lights flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, Jack felt the weight of the train's eerie stillness press down on him. The whispers, the strange voice, the unnatural passengers, they were all getting closer. They were surrounding him. They were waiting. "Where are we going?" Jack whispered to no one in particular, his voice barely audible over the sound of the train's humming engine. His throat tightened with fear, and his eyes darted back and forth, searching for an escape. No one answered. The train sped forward, faster now, faster than it should have been able to. The light in the distance was blinding now, a searing, almost heavenly glow that filled the entire horizon. Jack couldn't tear his eyes away from it. It was all he could see, this strange, unnatural light that beckoned him forward. And then, just as the train seemed to reach its highest speed, the darkness outside opened. The light was no longer just a distant glow. It had consumed the entire world outside the window. It wasn't just a light, it was a void, a bright, otherworldly space that stretched out before him. The train was no longer moving through the physical world, no longer bound to the tracks. It was moving through something else, something beyond the realm of his understanding. The light pulled at him at the very core of his being. He felt his muscles tighten, his skin crawl with the sensation of being yanked toward it. He gripped the edge of the seat, his nails digging into the fabric, but it was as if the train had already left him behind, as if he were being dragged along by some unseen force. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, to do anything to make it stop. But his voice caught in his throat, choked by the overwhelming sensation that this was the point of no return. The other passengers hadn't moved. They still sat in their seats, still locked in their gaze. But Jack could feel something shifting. The air had grown thick with a kind of tension, an expectation, as though the passengers were not merely waiting for the train to reach its destination. No, they were waiting for him. And then, for the first time since he'd boarded the train, Jack saw something, someone, move. The man in the long coat, the one who had been standing in the shadows at the far end of the car, began walking toward him. Slowly, deliberately. His footsteps were soundless, as if he were floating above the floor rather than walking on it. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes, those eyes, were locked on to Jack with an intensity that made his skin crawl. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath became shallow, quick, as the man moved closer. It felt like an eternity, like the very seconds of time were stretching out, pulling them both toward an unseen climax. The man stopped just in front of Jack, looming over him. And then, without a word, he spoke. "It's time," the man said, his voice cold and flat. It wasn't the voice of a human being. It was something else, something unnatural. "You're almost there." The words made no sense, and yet they felt like a terrible truth. Jack wanted to ask where there was, but the question died on his tongue. He knew better. He could feel it deep in his bones. Wherever there was, it was not a place he wanted to go. The man's eyes never left Jack as he turned slowly, deliberately, and walked toward the door at the end of the car. The train continued its unrelenting journey, the sound of the wheels on the tracks blending with the strange whispers that filled the air. And then, without warning, the lights went out. The train was plunged into darkness. The darkness was thick, the kind of darkness that pressed in from all sides, a heavy, suffocating void that swallowed everything, sight, sound, even thought itself. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart hammering so loudly in his chest that he couldn't hear the whispers anymore, couldn't hear the sound of the train's wheels on the tracks. It was as if time itself had stopped, frozen in place, leaving him in this suffocating blackness. He reached out instinctively, hands trembling as they scraped against the cold metal of the train's interior. His fingers brushed against something soft, fabric, perhaps, but there was no time to react. The air had grown unbearably still, and every sound that had filled the train car moments ago seemed to vanish, leaving nothing but the unnerving weight of silence. A silence so deep it could drive a man mad. Jack's mind raced, trying to process the situation, trying to find some rational explanation. But his thoughts were tangled, caught in a fog as thick and impenetrable as the darkness around him. The passengers, those strange, silent figures who had watched him with those hollow, unblinking eyes, they were still there, but he couldn't see them. He couldn't hear them. It was as though the very fabric of reality had unraveled, leaving him suspended in an empty, timeless space. The train moved on, faster now, and Jack could feel the pressure building, the sensation that they were headed towards something. But what? He didn't know. He couldn't know. And then, the light. At first, it was a faint pulse, a flicker in the distance. But then, like a lightning strike, the light burst into life. It illuminated the car with such intensity that Jack had to squint, his eyes stinging from the brightness. It wasn't the soft glow from before, the one that had beckoned him like a siren's call. No, this was something else, something harsh, almost violent. The light was coming from the end of the car, from the very door the man in the long coat had walked toward. Jack's pulse quickened as he felt a pull toward it, toward that terrible, blinding light. It was as if it were calling to him, drawing him closer, like a moth to the flame. He stood, his legs unsteady, the train rocking violently beneath him. For a moment, he thought he might lose his balance, fall and crash to the floor. But somehow, he stayed upright, moving slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that any sudden movement would cause the darkness to collapse on him entirely. Every step he took was met with an unnatural resistance, like the train itself was pushing back against him. But the light, it was getting stronger now, more blinding, and his feet carried him forward, against his will, against his better judgment. As he approached the door, he felt something, someone standing in his way. A presence just behind him, looming in the darkness. Jack turned sharply, but he couldn't see anyone. The cold sweat on his brow grew colder, his skin crawling with a sensation of being watched. But no one was there, or at least he couldn't see anyone. Still, the feeling lingered. They were waiting for him. The passengers, the man in the long coat, all of them. Jack reached the door at the end of the car, and with a trembling hand he grasped the handle. It was cold, slick with some kind of condensation, and for a moment he hesitated. What was on the other side? Was it the end of the train? The destination he had been so desperate to reach? But then, before he could open it, the light dimmed, flickered, and suddenly the whispers returned. They were louder now, not just a soft murmur in the background, but a chorus of voices, speaking all at once. Their words were incomprehensible, layered on top of each other, like the hum of 1,000 bees in the air. Jack staggered back, pressing his hands against his ears in an attempt to block out the sound. It was unbearable, each voice more guttural and alien than the last, their tone filled with anticipation. His pulse raced, his blood pounding in his ears as the temperature in the car dropped. He could see his breath now, puffs of vapor in the cold air. The shadows around him seemed to stretch, grow taller, lean in toward him. And then there was the sound of footsteps, heavy, slow, methodical. It was a sound Jack knew too well. The man in the long coat was coming back. Jack could feel him now, standing just behind him, the air around him thickening, as though the very presence of the man was changing the atmosphere itself. Every instinct told Jack to turn, to confront him, to demand answers. But he couldn't move. His body refused to obey him, paralyzed by the overwhelming dread that seemed to seep into his bones. The footsteps stopped, and Jack could feel the man's presence just a few inches away. "You don't understand," the man said softly, his voice low and measured. It was the first time he had spoken in what felt like an eternity, and his voice echoed with a strange resonance that rattled Jack's soul. "None of you do." The words sent a chill through Jack. His heart skipped a beat, and a sick feeling settled in his stomach. "What do you mean?" he forced himself to ask, his voice hoarse, as if the air itself had become too thick to breathe properly. But the man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, his face coming into the dim light of the car. Jack could see him now, really see him. The man's eyes were empty, two dark hollows that swallowed everything around them. There was no emotion in his expression, no humanity. He was a shell, a hollowed-out figure in a long, tattered coat. "We've been waiting for you." The words echoed in the car like a death knell. Jack's mind reeled as his legs finally gave way, his knees buckling beneath him, and he collapsed to the floor. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick now, suffocating, and the train seemed to move faster, impossibly fast. It was as if the entire world had been reduced to a blur. He could feel the weight of the passengers now, closing in on him, the pressure building, suffocating. They were closing in, and he couldn't escape. The man in the long coat stood over him, his face expressionless, cold as ice. The door to the train car was just a few feet away, the light so close now, but Jack knew deep down that it didn't matter. There was no escape, no way out. And then, in that blinding moment of clarity, Jack understood. The train wasn't heading to some distant city. It wasn't heading to a place of salvation. It was heading toward the end. The destination wasn't a station. It was a place where no one left, and no one ever returned. Jack's chest heaved with desperate breaths, each one more labored than the last. The train was no longer just a machine. It had become a living entity, pulsing with a malevolent energy that seeped into every inch of his being. His mind, still reeling from the man's revelation, struggled to hold on to any shred of hope, any last thread of sanity. But there was nothing left. The weight of it all, of the passengers, of the endless night, of the man's cold eyes, had crushed every ounce of resistance he had left. The man in the long coat didn't speak again. He simply stood there, looming over Jack, his shadow stretching across the floor like a dark omen. The cold air in the train car grew heavier, suffocating. Jack's breath came in shallow gasps, but no matter how deeply he inhaled, it was as if the air itself had turned poisonous. The train's speed was beyond anything natural, the sound of the wheels clattering against the tracks now a deafening roar. The windows were no longer just a view into the outside world. They had become a reflection of his own growing terror. The light, bright and unnatural, pulsed in rhythm with his racing heart, drawing him closer to the inevitable. He could feel it in his bones now, the presence of the passengers, their eyes never leaving him. They were still in their seats, still silent, but their energy was palpable, heavy, as if the very air around them vibrated with their anticipation. They were waiting for something, for him, and there was nothing Jack could do to stop it. He tried to push himself up, his legs trembling, his body weak with fear. But the moment his hands touched the cold metal floor, the train jolted again. It felt as though the earth itself had shifted beneath him. The world tilted on its axis, and for a brief moment, Jack felt as though he might fall off the edge of reality itself. He stumbled backward, his heart slamming against his ribs, his mouth dry as ash. The man in the long coat was still standing there, watching, waiting. His eyes, those endless black pits, never left Jack's face. They seemed to burrow deeper into his soul, like they could see everything. Every sin, every fear, every lie Jack had ever told. He couldn't look away. He didn't even want to try. The whispers began again, louder now, more insistent. They filled the air, crawling under Jack's skin, weaving their way into his thoughts. He could hear them all at once now, dozens, hundreds of voices, each one more alien than the last. The language was incomprehensible, but it didn't matter. Jack understood. They were calling him to the light, to the end. Suddenly the train lurched again, this time with such force that Jack was thrown against the wall. His head struck the metal with a sickening thud, and for a moment everything went black. But when he came to, he could still feel it, still hear it. The train was slowing down. A strange, unnatural calm settled over him as the train's speed decreased. The pulsating light outside the window dimmed, and Jack could hear the sound of his own breathing, ragged and desperate in the silence. It felt like the calm before the storm, the eerie lull that comes just before the inevitable crash. Jack's hand instinctively reached for the door once again, his fingers cold and unsteady as they brushed against the handle. But this time, something was different. The air was no longer cold. It was warm, almost too warm, as though the very atmosphere had shifted, closing in on him, suffocating him with an unbearable pressure. He turned the handle. The door creaked open, and Jack's stomach churned with dread as he stepped into the next car. The light here was different. The moment he crossed the threshold, the world seemed to warp. The train car stretched on impossibly long, as though the dimensions of the space had bent and twisted. There were no more seats, no more passengers, just endless rows of empty space stretching into nothingness. And at the far end of the car, a figure stood, tall, cloaked in darkness, its shape indistinct, like a shadow that had somehow come to life. It was waiting for him. Jack's heart clenched in his chest. This was it, the destination. "Welcome home," a voice said, soft but sharp, like the edge of a knife. It came from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the empty walls. Jack's legs buckled beneath him as he collapsed to the floor, his mind reeling. The figure at the end of the car stepped forward, its form becoming clearer now, its features emerging from the darkness, like something scraped from the deepest pits of his nightmares. The face. It wasn't a face at all, it was a mask, smooth and featureless, like the surface of a mirror reflecting no one. But behind the mask, Jack could feel the presence, something ancient, something unknowable. "You've been brought here for a reason," the voice whispered again. It was no longer a question. It was a statement. The voice was soothing, calm, and yet it chilled him to his core. "You are the one who will complete the journey." Jack didn't understand. His mind couldn't grasp the full meaning of the words, but he felt them in his bones. He was the one. He was the final piece. The train came to a stop. Not a gentle stop, not a smooth glide to a station. It was a violent halt, as if the world itself had come to an abrupt, jarring end. The light outside had faded completely. The dark, endless void outside the window was all-consuming. The shadows in the train car grew thicker, closing in on him, suffocating him. And still, the figure in the distance moved closer, each step a soundless, echoing drumbeat in Jack's mind. It was coming for him. And then, in that split second of realization, Jack understood everything. The train wasn't a transport. It wasn't meant to take him anywhere. It was never about getting home. The train was the journey, the destination. This was the end. A door opened, not a literal one, but a portal, an exit, a way out, but not the way Jack had imagined, not a return to safety. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the final door. The figure reached him, slowly, deliberately, its mask still smooth, still empty. Jack closed his eyes, and in the final moment before the darkness overtook him, he whispered into the void, "I'm sorry. I didn't want to." But there was no answer, only the silence. The train had stopped, and Jack was no longer aboard. There's a certain kind of promise in a new house, the fresh paint and undisturbed corners, the echoes of a new life yet to be lived. Michael and Rachel had been married for just under 2 years, and this house was meant to be their fresh start, a place to build their future, to make memories. It was a small, charming 2-story nestled in the quiet countryside, a little over an hour outside the city, far enough away to feel like an escape, but close enough to visit whenever they needed. The house had been on the market for months, but when they saw it, something about the place called to them. It felt right. At least that's what they told themselves when they signed the papers. The first few nights in the house were filled with the usual adjustment period, arranging furniture, unpacking boxes, and trying to make the unfamiliar feel like home. The attic was off limits for now, just an empty space full of dusty boxes, an old pull-down ladder that creaked in protest every time they tried to use it. Michael had joked that they would make it a man cave one day, though Rachel had rolled her eyes at the idea. Still, it wasn't a space they needed right away, and so it was left undisturbed for the time being. But on the third night, the scurrying began. It was late, after midnight, maybe closer to 1 in the morning, when the sound first pierced the quiet of their bedroom. It started off faint, like the scurrying of small feet, barely perceptible against the hush of the house. Rachel had heard it first, a soft rustling, a faint scratching. She lifted her head from the pillow, listening intently, as Michael snored softly beside her. She thought it was just the wind, or maybe a tree branch brushing against the window, but no, it was closer than that. She listened again. The sound was coming from the ceiling, directly above their bedroom. Squirrels, she thought. There must be squirrels in the attic. It was an old house, after all. It wouldn't be the first time they'd heard such noises in a place like this. She turned to Michael, nudging him gently. "Mike," she whispered, "do you hear that?" Michael mumbled something in his sleep, then rolled over onto his side. He was out cold, and the scurrying continued, growing a little louder, a little more persistent. Rachel pulled the blankets tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes, hoping the noise would fade away. But it didn't. It continued throughout the night, a series of soft, scratching noises above their heads, as if tiny paws were scuttling across the rafters, making their way through the empty space. The next morning, after a restless night of interrupted sleep, Rachel mentioned the sounds to Michael while they sat at the kitchen table, sipping their coffee. She didn't want to sound paranoid, but it had been unsettling. "Did you hear that last night?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Michael looked up from the newspaper, his brow furrowing in thought. "What do you mean?" "The noise," she said, trying to make her voice sound light. "Like scurrying from the attic?" Michael paused, setting his coffee cup down. "You sure?" It was probably just squirrels. They're everywhere this time of year. Rachel nodded, not entirely convinced, but willing to accept his explanation for now. After all, They were in a house surrounded by trees, and squirrels were a common nuisance. It wasn't anything to get worked up about. "You might be right," she agreed, giving him a small smile. Later that afternoon, after Michael had gone to run some errands, Rachel found herself alone in the house. The attic door was just above the stairs, a small wooden hatch with an old-fashioned pull-down ladder. She glanced up at it, the curiosity in her chest beginning to grow again. She wondered if the squirrels had really made their way into the attic, or if something else was up there. She grabbed a broom from the closet and pushed the ladder down with it, the old wood creaking and groaning as it extended. The attic felt like an unknown territory, a place she had no reason to explore but couldn't help feeling drawn to. It was the kind of space that held the lingering remnants of forgotten things, boxes of old clothes, forgotten photographs, a dust-covered chair or two. It wasn't a place people usually visited unless they had a reason to. And she had no reason to go up there. But still, the scurrying noise. It bothered her more than she wanted to admit. The ladder touched the floor with a soft thud. Rachel hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the bottom rung. Her stomach fluttered uneasily as the silence of the house pressed in around her. She wasn't exactly sure what she expected to find. Perhaps some evidence of squirrels running amok, or maybe even the source of the strange sound she'd heard. But she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. With a sigh, she climbed the ladder, pushing the hatch open slowly, the wood squealing in protest. She could feel the weight of the house above her, the air in the attic, thick and musty. It was so dark up there, the only light coming from the narrow strip between the edges of the attic door. She didn't have a flashlight, but the light from the open hatch provided just enough to make out the outlines of dusty boxes and old furniture. She stepped into the attic, careful not to disturb anything. The scurrying had stopped. Now, all she could hear was the sound of her own breathing, a soft exhale of air mixing with the musty scent of old wood. She stepped further in, her eyes scanning the dim space, searching for anything that could explain the noise. And then she saw it. In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by an old wardrobe, 2 faint pinpricks of light flickered, like tiny glowing embers. Rachel froze. Her breath caught in her throat, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. The lights didn't move, they didn't blink, they simply stared at her from the darkness, unblinking, unrelenting. She didn't know why, but something told her that they weren't the reflection of a forgotten light bulb, or even the glow from a window. No, these were eyes staring at her from the shadows. Her heart began to pound in her chest, her body trembling as she took an involuntary step backward. She reached for the ladder, but before she could take another step, the eyes blinked. Once. And in that instant, something inside her shifted. It wasn't just the eyes that terrified her. It was the feeling, the unmistakable presence of something waiting in the dark, watching her. Rachel stumbled backward, her breath coming in shallow gasps, and without a second thought, she scrambled back down the ladder, slamming the hatch shut behind her. She leaned against the wall, clutching her chest, trying to steady her breathing. She could feel the weight of those eyes lingering on her, even as she stood safely back on the main floor of the house. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, maybe dust or a trick of the light. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. That evening, after Michael returned home, Rachel didn't mention what she'd seen. The words caught in her throat, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. But something had changed. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were not alone in the house. Something, or someone, was up there. And whatever it was, it didn't want them there. The next day, the house felt different. It wasn't a change anyone could see, but it was there. underneath everything. It felt heavier somehow, as if something had settled within its walls, a presence that wasn't there before. The silence felt oppressive, like the walls themselves were closing in around them. Michael and Rachel both felt it, though neither of them spoke about it. Neither wanted to admit that something was wrong, that something was waiting. Rachel spent most of the day trying to distract herself, organizing the kitchen, unpacking the last few boxes, trying to put her mind at ease. But the image of those eyes, those glowing, unblinking eyes, kept pushing through the fog of her thoughts. She couldn't shake the memory, the terror. The way they had watched her from the dark corner of the attic, waiting. She had convinced herself for a moment that it had been a trick of the light, that perhaps the house was old, the wood creaking and shifting, playing tricks on her. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that wasn't true. This wasn't just some random shadow or play of light. There was something up there, watching. When Michael got home that evening, he seemed almost unaware of the weight hanging in the air. He was tired, his eyes shadowed from a long day at work, but he tried to be cheerful, cracking jokes as he set down his briefcase by the door. Rachel didn't feel like laughing. "Hey," he said, glancing at her as he poured himself a glass of water. "Did you finish unpacking everything?" She nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, just about. The kitchen is pretty much done." He grinned, though his eyes weren't quite as bright as usual. He was just as tired as she was, but his exhaustion seemed to have a different edge to it, a weariness that made his smile feel a little more strained. "Good. You hungry? We could grab a pizza or something." She shook her head. "I'm fine." Her mind kept going back to the attic, to the eyes. She couldn't explain it, but the idea of being anywhere near that space filled her with a deep, instinctual dread. It wasn't like she'd never been afraid before. Everyone was afraid of something. But this was different. She couldn't go back up there. Not alone. She shouldn't go up there at all. Michael, however, seemed completely oblivious. He'd always been the rational one between them, the kind of person who dismissed things he couldn't explain with a shrug and a laugh. Maybe it was that confidence in his own reasoning that made her hesitant to share what had happened the night before. She didn't want to sound crazy. "Maybe I'll go take a look around the attic later," he said, setting his glass down on the counter, giving her a casual smile. "Check for the squirrels. I'll put down some traps if I have to." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. He was going up there, after what had happened, after what she'd seen. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him not to go, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she stood there, her throat tight, the air between them heavy with unspoken fear. Michael raised an eyebrow, clearly puzzled by her sudden shift in mood. "What's wrong? You okay?" I don't know. I just don't think you should go up there," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave her a concerned look. "Rachel!" "You know it's just squirrels. You're letting your imagination get to you. There's nothing up there that can hurt us." The words stung. It was as if he was dismissing her fear altogether, as if it was nothing more than a passing thought. He didn't understand. "I'm serious, Michael. There's something in the attic. I don't know what it is, but I saw it." She saw his expression change, just for a moment, as if he didn't quite know how to respond. He took a deep breath, setting the glass down, and walked over to where she stood. "Rachel," he said, his voice softening, "I know you're scared, but you can't let this kind of thing get to you. I'll go up there, I'll check it out, and I'll make sure everything's fine, okay?" His reassurance felt hollow to her. She didn't want his promises, didn't want to be placated. She wanted him to listen, to understand that something was wrong, that there was something in that house, something waiting. But instead of pressing it further, She simply nodded, her heart sinking as she felt the conversation slip away. That night, after dinner, Rachel was in the living room, sitting on the couch, pretending to read a book. But her thoughts were miles away, fixated on the attic. She kept glancing up at the ceiling, imagining she could still hear the faint, scurrying noise. It wasn't as loud as before, but it was there, just beneath the surface, like a whisper waiting to be heard. And then the ladder creaked. Rachel froze. Her heart skipped a beat as she slowly turned her head toward the stairwell, the door to the attic hatch now plainly visible at the top of the stairs. There, at the bottom, Michael stood. The dim light from the hallway cast shadows over his face, making him look far away, as if he was standing at the edge of a nightmare. He had climbed the ladder, and she hadn't even heard him. The attic door opened, and for a split second, Rachel thought she saw a flicker of movement just behind Michael. Something shifting in the shadows, but when she blinked, it was gone. "Mike?" Her voice came out sharper than she meant it to. He didn't respond at first, but then slowly turned around, his face strained with confusion. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." She couldn't explain it. She didn't know how to make him understand what she was feeling. But when he looked up at the attic door, his face twisted into a look of concern. "What is it? You didn't hear anything, did you?" "Something's up there," she whispered, barely able to keep the words from tumbling out. I saw eyes." Michael's face paled, the colour draining from his cheeks. "Eyes? What do you mean, Rachel?" "I'm telling you, Mike," she said, her voice trembling now. "There's something up there. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's real, but those eyes—" She trailed off, unsure of how to explain the terror that had gripped her chest, the bone-deep certainty that they were not alone in the house. He looked at her for a long time, his face unreadable. Finally, he sighed and stepped toward her, taking her hand in his. "Rachel, you're not making sense. Maybe it's just your imagination. You know how your mind can play tricks on you. I'm sure it's nothing." She wanted to scream, to tell him that his rationality would get them both killed, but she didn't. She couldn't. Instead, she stared at the stairs, the attic door, and felt that dark weight bearing down on them, waiting. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Michael had always been the calm one, the one who believed in facts, in logic, in science. Rachel had always been the more intuitive one, the one who trusted her gut. But what had happened over the past few days, what Rachel had seen, what they had both felt, was beyond anything either of them could explain away. As he stood at the bottom of the attic stairs, Michael felt the weight of it press in on him. The house was unnaturally silent. He could hear the faint ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. It all seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the feeling that someone was watching him. Rachel stood behind him, her presence a heavy weight at his back. Her hand was resting on his shoulder, and her fingers were cold. Michael turned around, meeting her eyes. Her expression was distant, eyes unfocused, like she was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world that he couldn't reach. "Mike, please," she whispered, "don't do it. Don't go up there." He felt a flicker of uncertainty, something he hadn't felt in years. He wanted to tell her that everything was going to be fine, that there was no reason to be afraid. But that was a lie, and they both knew it. "Rachel," he said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he didn't know how to place. "I have to see for myself. You're scared. I get that. But this can't go on. We'll figure it out together. I promise." She didn't answer. She didn't even nod. She simply stared at him, her eyes wide, pleading. And for the first time in his life, Michael felt a wave of doubt crash over him, a gnawing sense that he was walking into something that he wouldn't be able to escape. But he had to. He had to do something. He had to prove to himself that this was all just a figment of their imagination, a trick of the mind. He climbed the ladder slowly, the rungs cold beneath his palms, the sound of the creaking wood echoing in the stillness of the house. Rachel stayed at the foot of the stairs, her hands wringing together nervously, her breath shallow. She didn't move. When he reached the top of the ladder, he paused for a moment, looking into the darkened attic. It was pitch black up there, thick, impenetrable darkness, as if the space itself were alive, breathing, watching. He felt a shiver run down his spine, but he forced himself to keep going. He reached for the light switch near the entrance, flicking it on. The light bulb above sputtered to life, casting an eerie glow across the cluttered attic. It revealed the dusty boxes, the old furniture covered in sheets, the forgotten remnants of lives lived long before him. The space felt stagnant, untouched, but there was something else, something wrong. Something. Michael stepped forward, scanning the room for anything unusual. But it looked just as it had the day before, empty, quiet, full of dust and shadows. He sighed with relief, his tension easing a little. "There's nothing here," he muttered under his breath. "See, Rachel? Just an old attic." But as he moved further into the room, his foot caught on something. Something soft, something that didn't feel like wood or stone. He stumbled forward, his heart lurching in his chest, and when he looked down, he saw it. A piece of fabric. At first, he thought it was an old coat, something that had been left behind by the previous owners. But as he bent down to touch it, he realized it wasn't fabric at all. It was skin. Michael recoiled, his blood turning to ice, as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The piece of skin, thin and pale, lay there, half hidden beneath a pile of old boxes. It was like something that had been peeled from a person, scraped away, left to rot. His breath caught in his throat as he stared at the sickening thing before him. He reached out slowly, touching the edge of it, and felt a wave of nausea rise in his stomach. It was cold, too cold. Suddenly, he heard a rustle behind him. His head whipped around. The attic was still empty, but something wasn't right. The air had changed. It was heavier now, thick with a presence that he couldn't see but could feel, something dark, something ancient, something watching him with eyes he couldn't quite find. Before he could move, he heard it again, a soft scratching like something trying to climb. Slowly the sound grew louder, sharper, more frantic. It came from the far corner of the attic. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly backed toward the ladder. He called out to Rachel, his voice shaking with panic. "Rachel, get up here now!" But as soon as the words left his mouth, the light overhead flickered. It didn't just flicker, it buzzed. And then the whole attic plunged into darkness. For a moment there was nothing but silence, a suffocating, heavy silence that seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Michael's breath came in shallow gasps, his body frozen in place. The scratching noise had stopped, but something else had taken its place, something far worse. A whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, closer, until Michael could hear it right in his ear, as if it was coming from inside his head. The whisper was a voice, soft and cold. "Leave." The word curled through him like ice, and before he could react, the attic light flickered back to life. Only it wasn't the same light anymore. The light above him wasn't warm or comforting. It had become a sickly, greenish glow, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched across the attic like fingers. And in the corner of the room, the corner where the rustling sound had come from, he saw it. The eyes, two bright, glowing orbs, staring at him from the shadows. They were no longer just a flicker. They were there, full of malice, wide and unblinking, watching him. It took everything Michael had to tear his gaze away, to force himself to look at the ladder. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking, heart pounding so hard in his chest that he thought it might explode. Leave. The whisper came again, and this time it was louder, more forceful. Michael didn't think. He didn't have time to think. He lunged for the ladder, nearly tripping over the boxes in his desperation to escape. His foot missed the first rung, and for a terrifying second he thought he might fall, but somehow he managed to grab hold and climb down as fast as he could, his hands scraping against the rough wood of the ladder. He landed on the floor of the attic, breathing heavily, feeling like his chest would cave in. But as soon as his feet touched the ground, he realized he had forgotten one thing. The most important thing, Rachel. He spun around, his eyes searching the dark stairwell for any sign of her, but there was nothing. The space above the attic door was empty. "Rachel!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. And then he heard it, her voice, a faint, distant whisper from above. "Don't come back." Michael's mind raced, spinning in a frenzy of terror. The attic door behind him was still open, the only thing separating him from the abyss of darkness above. He could feel it. Something was waiting up there, something alive, something hungry. The air had become thick, stifling, like the house itself was holding its breath. "Don't come back." The words hung in the air, lingering, as if they were seeping into his skin, making his bones ache. His pulse thudded in his temples, his body frozen in place. The whisper had been so clear, so real, but it was impossible. No one was up there, no one except the eyes. God, the eyes! He whipped around, his eyes scanning the room for Rachel, but there was no sign of her. The house had fallen into an unnerving silence, the kind that wraps itself around you and squeezes the air out of your lungs. "Rachel!" His voice cracked as he called her name again. No answer. Nothing but the cold whisper of the wind that seeped through the cracks in the walls. He glanced at the stairs again. Every part of him screamed to run, to escape, but something kept him rooted to the floor. His feet felt like lead, his legs trembling beneath him. He couldn't leave her up there, he couldn't. And yet, the whisper came again, closer this time, like something was right behind him. "Leave this place." The air thickened even more, suffocating him. He took a hesitant step back, his fingers clenching into fists as his breathing became shallow and uneven. His throat felt tight, like a vice was pressing down on it, and his vision blurred as panic swept over him. His whole body screamed to run, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the attic door. Something in there was watching him. He could feel it deep in his bones. "Rachel, please," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where are you?" A faint sound echoed from the stairs, the creak of wood, like something heavy was being dragged across it. Slowly, Michael turned back to the ladder, and there, in the gloom above, he saw her. Rachel's face appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide, pupils dilated with fear. She was trembling, her clothes torn, her hair wild and matted. She looked different, like a shell of the woman he had married. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Only a low, guttural sound, like a strangled cry, spilled from her mouth. Michael took a step forward, reaching out toward her, his heart hammering in his chest. "Rachel? What happened? Are you okay?" She didn't respond. Instead, she took a shaky step down the ladder, and then another. But with each movement, she seemed less like herself and more like a shadow, a broken, hollow version of the woman he had known. "Rachel!" His voice cracked again, and he rushed toward her, but just as he reached out to grab her arm, she collapsed, not in a graceful fall, but like a rag doll, her body twisting unnaturally as she hit the floor with a sickening thud. Michael fell to his knees beside her, his hands shaking as he turned her over. Her skin was cold to the touch, pale, as if the life had been drained from her. Her eyes were open wide, staring at him, but they weren't her eyes. They were glassy, devoid of recognition, as if whatever had been inside her had been sucked out completely. A sudden, chilling realization gripped Michael's chest. Rachel wasn't Rachel anymore, not completely. The whispering voice that had tormented him earlier returned, but now it was louder, insistent, as if mocking him. "You should have listened!" Michael's breath caught in his throat. He tried to shake her, to snap her out of whatever trance she was in, but it was as if he was shaking a corpse. The attic door creaked again, this time opening wider. He dared not look up, but the pull of the darkness above was irresistible, like an invisible hand drawing him toward it. His heart raced in his chest, but he forced himself to look. And there, just beyond the threshold of the attic, in the blackness beyond the light, he saw them. The eyes, hundreds of eyes, all blinking, all watching him. Frozen, he stared into the void, his mind trying to grasp the impossibility of what he was seeing. How could this be happening? How could he be here, standing in this house, looking at this nightmare? The whisper came again, this time from somewhere behind him. "You're too late." The words slithered through him, and his heart skipped a beat. He whipped around, the dread pooling in his stomach, and saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. A figure that was all shadow, its outline indistinct, but undeniably human. No, not human. It didn't look human. The figure took a step forward, and the eyes followed. Eyes that blinked, eyes that were not meant to exist. They blinked in unison, and in that moment Michael realized the truth. They weren't watching him. They were watching Rachel, watching her like she was prey. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body was paralyzed, his limbs stiff with fear. Rachel's body twitched violently, and then her head jerked back, her neck stretching at an unnatural angle as she let out a terrible, bone-chilling scream, a scream that tore through Michael like a knife. It was the scream of something not human. Before he could move, the shadows surged forward, filling the space around them like smoke. The eyes were everywhere now, everywhere, and they weren't just watching, they were waiting. And they were hungry. Rachel's mouth opened wide, impossibly wide, and a shrill, inhuman shriek ripped from her throat as she twisted and contorted on the ground. Her body shuddered, every muscle in her being spasming in a grotesque, agonizing dance. The eyes watched, and Michael felt the weight of their hunger settle on him, like a shadow threatening to consume him whole. The shadows swirled, and suddenly the room around him seemed to stretch and distort, the walls bending and warping like the inside of some grotesque dream. His head spun, his vision blurred. The air became thick, choked with the scent of rot and decay. The whispers grew louder, frantic, their voices a cacophony of agony and rage. "You should have left. It's too late now. We're hungry." And then, just as quickly as it had all begun, the house fell silent. But the silence wasn't peace. It was a warning. Michael's hands were still shaking, his heart racing in his chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to look at Rachel, who was no longer there, no longer a person, only an empty shell, her body contorted in ways it shouldn't have been. And then, in the corner of his eye, he saw them again, the eyes glowing from the attic, staring at him. The silence didn't last long. In fact, Michael realized that the silence was far worse than any sound, because it was the kind of silence that fills you with a dread so deep you feel as if you might suffocate under its weight. His breathing was the only sound in the house now, shallow, ragged, and frantic, like someone running a race they couldn't finish. He was no longer sure where the edges of reality ended and the nightmare began. Everything felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. He couldn't look at Rachel. He couldn't. Not after what had happened to her, what had become of her. The eyes had watched her, and then they had taken her. And now they were coming for him. The shadows in the room were moving again. The walls seemed to pulse, as if the house itself was alive, breathing in the dark, feeding off his terror. He could feel the weight of those eyes on him, watching him from the attic, from every corner of the room, from places he couldn't see but could feel. Michael stumbled backward, his legs unsteady, his body shaking with the cold that had settled deep in his bones. His thoughts were a jumbled mess. There was no logic to any of this, no reason for what was happening. He just knew that he had to get out. He had to escape. But the door was locked. His gaze flickered to the front door and his heart skipped a beat. It was still there, sitting innocently in its frame, just out of reach. He could see the sliver of moonlight that spilled in through the cracks in the window, a small slice of freedom. But the door might as well have been 100 miles away. It might as well have been another world entirely. He turned around, eyes darting back to the attic. The ladder still stood there, but it was more like a doorway to hell now, a portal to something darker than he could comprehend. He wanted to scream. He wanted to scream for help. But the truth was there was no one who could save him now. The house was no longer just a house. It was a tomb, and he was its final prisoner. The whisper came again, this time clearer, more insistent. "You should have left." Michael's chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. The voice was so close now, like it was right behind him, like it was inside his head. His fingers trembled as he reached out toward the door, as if some invisible force was pushing against him, keeping him in place. He stumbled, his back slamming into the wall, his hands reaching for something to hold on to, but there was nothing. The air around him was thick with dread, and the smell of rot was overpowering now, filling his nostrils. It was everywhere. The stench seemed to crawl beneath his skin like worms burrowing their way into his very flesh. He knew that if he looked up again, he would see them, the eyes, watching him, waiting. But something else, something worse, was stirring. The house had begun to creak, groan, and shift in ways that didn't make sense. The floorboards beneath his feet seemed to buckle and flex, like the house itself was stretching, shifting as if it were alive. The walls seemed to bend, warping in impossible angles, distorting, twisting, until they no longer looked like walls at all, but jagged black teeth ready to snap shut on him. And then he heard it, a sound, a slow, deliberate scratching, like nails on wood, coming from the stairs above him. The noise was methodical, deliberate, like someone or something was climbing down, slowly, patiently. Michael's heart thundered in his chest. His feet felt rooted to the floor, as if the very foundation of the house had come alive to trap him. He knew what was coming. His fingers clenched into fists, the nails digging into his palms. He had to move. He had to run. But where? Where could he go? Then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, Michael understood. The house wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just a place cursed by dark forces. The house was the dark force, and it wasn't just waiting for him. It had been waiting for them, waiting for Rachel, for him, waiting for anyone who had the misfortune to cross its threshold. It was hungry. The scratching grew louder, closer. It was like 1,000 nails scraping against the wood. And then, Just as the noise reached its peak, the air shifted again, as if something or someone had stepped into the room. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he turned slowly toward the source of the sound. And there it was, a figure draped in shadow, standing in the doorway to the attic. Its eyes were wide, impossibly wide, like deep black pits of endless void. But the worst part, it wasn't Rachel anymore. It couldn't have been. It was something else, something horrible. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, and then another, its movements jerky and unnatural, like it was struggling to control its own body. Michael's mind screamed at him to run, to do anything to get away, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as if the house had claimed him, had anchored him to this place of darkness. He could see the eyes now glowing faintly in the dim light. And it was then that he realized the eyes weren't just a feature of the figure in the doorway. Number! They were everywhere, the shadows above him, in the corners of the room, crawling along the walls, eyes, thousands of them. They blinked in unison, all focusing on him. And in the center of them, he could see the shape of Rachel, or what was left of her. The woman who had once been his wife was now a husk, puppet of darkness, her mouth opened wide, wider than it should have, and a terrible, bone-chilling sound poured from her throat. It was a scream, but it wasn't her scream. It was the scream of something ancient, something that had waited in the dark for too long. And then the eyes, those eyes, rushed forward, the shadows leaping from every corner of the room, flooding toward him, swallowing him whole. It always started the same way. The soft click of the second hand, barely noticeable at first. The kind of sound you'd hear if you focused too hard on the background noise of a quiet room. But then it grew, like a whisper in the dark, persistent and unrelenting. Tick, 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 tick. At first, Robert had convinced himself it was nothing. The house was old after all, creaky floors, groaning pipes, and the faint hum of an ancient refrigerator in the kitchen. He'd been living in this house for nearly a year now, and he had grown used to the strange sounds it made. But this was different. This sound was persistent. It was always there, night after night, as if the house itself had a heartbeat. Only the beat wasn't quite right. Tick, tick, tick. It came from nowhere, yet it filled the space around him with an undeniable presence. The first time it happened, Robert had convinced himself it was just a clock somewhere in the house that he hadn't noticed. Perhaps one of the grandfather clocks in the dusty corners, hidden away by the previous owners. Or maybe the old mantel clock in the living room, its chimes long gone silent, but the ticking still echoing in the stillness. He had checked, of course. He had searched the house from top to bottom, crawling into the attic, and even checking behind the walls, pulling off the thin veneer of plaster in the hope of finding some hidden timepiece. But there was nothing. The house was empty of clocks, yet still the ticking came. At first, it was a subtle presence, like the background noise of a crumbling building. He would hear it late at night, just as he was drifting off to sleep, a faint, rhythmic pulse that seemed to come from every direction. By the time he pulled himself from the warmth of his bed, half awake, he would find no source for it, nothing to explain the sound. Tick, tick, tick. As the days wore on, the ticking grew louder, more pronounced. It was as if it were echoing inside his skull, vibrating through his bones until it was all he could focus on. His days became a blur of distraction as he fought against the creeping sensation that time was slipping away from him. The ticking was relentless, like the ticking of a bomb, growing closer and closer to some final, inevitable moment. He couldn't explain it. He didn't want to, but deep down, Robert knew something had changed. It was no longer just a sound, it had become a presence. One night, as the clock struck midnight, something shifted in the air. The hairs on the back of Robert's neck stood on end, and his breath caught in his throat as the ticking reached a fever pitch. It seemed louder now, more insistent, as though the clock was no longer just ticking away the seconds. It was counting down, tick, 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 and with each tick, he felt the pressure in his chest mount, as if the hands of some unseen force were tightening around his throat. The air in his bedroom grew heavy, thick with the oppressive weight of time itself. Robert sat up in bed, his eyes wide with a growing sense of dread. He couldn't tell if the sound was real, or if it was some twisted manifestation of his own mind, a product of stress or exhaustion. But it was real. He could feel it. It was there, and it was coming for him. The clock's relentless ticking echoed louder, filling the room, bouncing off the walls, reverberating inside his skull. He pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The sound wouldn't stop. It couldn't stop. He glanced at his nightstand, his eyes instinctively drawn to the old watch he kept there, a gift from his father. It was a fine watch, a relic from another time, but it had long stopped ticking. The minute hand had broken off years ago, and the second hand had been stuck in place for even longer. The watch had no power left in it, at least that was what Robert had told himself. Yet now, sitting in the dim light of the room, his eyes fixed on that watch, and he swore that he saw the second hand twitch. Just a slight movement, but it was enough. The movement was imperceptible to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but Robert was paying attention. He sat there, frozen, his gaze locked on the watch, his heart pounding in his chest as the clock above him ticked louder and louder, closer and closer to midnight. The walls seemed to close in around him, and for the first time since moving into the house, he felt trapped in time itself. Tick, tick, tick. He stood suddenly, his legs unsteady, as if his body had been paralyzed by the sound. He stumbled across the room to the watch, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch it. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the watch's face, and his pulse quickened as he felt the faintest vibration beneath his fingertips. The watch, it was alive, it was ticking. A sudden wave of nausea hit him, and he pulled his hand back as though burned. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening, but there was no logic to it, no reason for it. The ticking was real, and it wasn't just some random noise. It was tied to him, tied to his fate, a countdown to something. The room seemed to spin around him, and the walls groaned under the pressure, as though they too could sense the clock's growing influence. The ticking was no longer just sound, it was weight in the air, a palpable force pressing in on him from all sides. Midnight was coming. Robert tried to steady himself, but his mind was racing, his thoughts a jumbled mess. What was happening? Why was the ticking getting louder? Why did it feel as though it was counting down to something he couldn't control? The watch. The watch was moving. He turned his attention back to the nightstand, his breath shallow. The second hand of the watch, he was sure of it now, was moving. Slowly, but it was moving, ticking down with the same rhythmic persistence as the sound echoing around him. And with each tick, Robert could feel the pressure mounting in his chest, as though the hands of the clock were turning on him, wrapping tighter and tighter around his heart. Tick, tick, tick. And then, as the clock struck the final minute before midnight, a new sound joined the ticking. A soft scratching noise coming from behind him. Robert froze, every muscle in his body locking up. He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, and for the briefest moment, just a split second, he thought he saw a shadow moving in the corner of the room. But no. He blinked, and the shadow was gone. Yet the ticking continued, louder now, more insistent. Tick, tick, tick. And with each passing second he knew, whatever was coming, it was closer now. The clock was counting down to something final. The clock had changed. It wasn't just the ticking. No, that was something far more sinister. It had grown louder, faster. It echoed in Robert's ears, relentless, like the pounding of a drum. But it wasn't just the ticking. There was something else in the air. A presence. A heaviness that seemed to press against his chest, making it hard to breathe. Tick, tick, tick. It was as though the clock wasn't counting time, it was counting him down. Every second that passed seemed to crush the air out of him. He could feel it now, this invisible weight pressing down on him, making him feel small, trapped in a world that didn't make sense anymore. The house, once so familiar, now seemed like a foreign landscape. The walls seemed to close in, the ticking reverberating in every crack, every crevice. It was inside the walls, inside his mind. There was no escape. He glanced at the old watch again, the one on his nightstand. He was sure it had moved. He had watched it tick, barely noticeable at first, but there was no denying it now. The second hand was in motion. The cold metal felt alive beneath his fingertips, pulsating with some unnatural energy. He couldn't take his eyes off it. Tick, tick, tick. A knot formed in his stomach, tightening as the realization set in. This wasn't just a random occurrence. This was deliberate. This was designed. The clock wasn't counting time. It was counting down to something. And it wasn't a simple countdown to midnight. No, it felt as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling, the ticking slicing through it like a razor-sharp edge. Robert wiped his face with his trembling hands, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold chill in the room. He glanced at the clock on the wall, the one above the mantel. Midnight was nearing. The time was ticking away. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of the house. He had been telling himself that for days now. The pressure was too much, the ticking, the feeling of something unseen hovering just beyond his vision. It was all too much. He threw the covers off his legs and stood up, his body shaking, his heart hammering in his chest. He moved quickly toward the door, but the moment his hand touched the knob, the sound changed. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, came from the walls. His pulse quickened, and he froze. His hand lingered on the knob, unsure whether to open the door or step back. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was closer now. His skin prickled with a sudden rush of cold, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He stepped back, staring at the wall as if expecting something, someone, to emerge from it. The walls, once comforting in their silence, now felt suffocating. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was then he noticed the shadows in the corners of the room. They had shifted. It was subtle, but it was enough. He could see them moving, slithering like tendrils of darkness creeping toward him. The clock ticked louder now, each beat syncing with his racing heartbeat. The walls groaned, as if they too were alive, the house breathing with a rhythm that wasn't his own. Tick, tick, tick. The second hand of the watch inched forward, a slow, agonizing crawl toward midnight. Robert's legs felt weak, his breath shallow. He stumbled toward the window, desperate for some kind of escape. Maybe if he could break the glass, he could climb out, run into the night, away from this nightmare. But the window, too, had changed. The glass, once clear, was now clouded with a thick layer of frost. The night outside was a void. Nothingness. There was no escape. He turned back to the room. The shadows were closer now, and the scratching had stopped. But the silence was worse. The The ticking had intensified, louder, quicker. It was like the ticking had spread, filling the very air, suffocating him. The pressure was unbearable. He could almost feel the seconds closing in on him, like a countdown to a final moment. And then, just as he thought he might lose his mind from the relentless sound, the clock above the mantel did something that froze him in place. It stopped. No ticking, no sound, just an oppressive, heavy silence. For a long moment, Robert stood there, motionless, unsure if he had imagined it. But no, the silence was real, and it felt wrong. He glanced at the watch on his nightstand. The second hand had stopped as well. Everything stopped, and that's when he heard it. A whisper. A low, raspy voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was the kind of voice that would make your blood run cold, the kind of voice that crawled under your skin and made you feel like something was watching you, just beyond your peripheral vision. It's time. The whisper sent a chill through his spine, and Robert spun around, searching the room for the source. But there was nothing. The room was empty. Just him, the oppressive darkness, and the ticking clock. But he knew. He knew that something had changed. The pressure, the fear, the suffocating weight of the room, it was all building to something. And whatever it was, he was running out of time. The house had shifted. The clock had shifted. Time wasn't just passing anymore. Time was moving toward him, with him. He had to find out what was happening. He had to understand what the clock meant before it was too late. The seconds ticked away again, slow but measured. Each one felt like an eternity. Tick, 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 but the countdown had begun. And Robert was no longer sure whether it was the clock that was ticking or if it was his own life. Robert's pulse hammered in his ears, the rhythm of it syncing with the ever-present ticking that filled the room. Tick, tick, tick. Each second felt like an eternity, a slow, suffocating march towards something he could neither see nor understand. The silence between the ticks had become unbearable. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his chest tight, as though the very air in the room had turned to stone. He glanced at the old mantel clock again. Its hands were frozen, but the sound of ticking still echoed around him, an invisible force that vibrated through the walls. He could feel it beneath his skin, like a low-frequency hum that made his bones ache. And there, in the thick silence between the ticks, he could swear he felt something else, something darker, deeper than time itself. It was a presence. Something was watching him. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room. Nothing at all. But his skin crawled with the sensation that the shadows were moving, closing in on him. The clock above the mantel, the watch on his nightstand, the very walls of the house, they were all alive now, pulsing with the rhythm of the ticking, as though they were all part of the same terrible machinery. He tried to ignore the panic rising in his chest, but it was impossible. His legs trembled as he stumbled backward, crashing into the bedpost. The room seemed smaller now, as though the walls were pressing in on him, inch by inch. The air was thick with tension, and the ticking, it was louder now, closer. Tick, tick, tick. His hand shook as he reached for the phone on his nightstand, dialing the number he knew he had to call. His thumb hovered over the button, but when he tried to bring it to his ear, the sound came again. A whisper, soft but unmistakable. "It's too late?" Robert froze. His eyes darted around the room, but no one was there. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere. It had come from inside his own head, a part of his mind that he didn't recognize. The voice seemed to be growing, filling the empty space around him, suffocating him. He felt it curl around his thoughts like a constricting coil, tightening, suffocating until he could no longer think straight. He pressed the phone to his ear, but the line was dead. The ticking was too loud now, drowning out everything else, and he couldn't hear the dial tone. The phone was useless as the watch on his nightstand, the one that still moved. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Time is not on your side, Robert. It never was." His heart lurched in his chest, a wave of cold fear sweeping over him. His legs buckled, and he sank to his knees, the ticking pounding in his ears, the voice in his head louder now. He could feel it gnawing at his sanity, threatening to rip him apart from the inside. His mind screamed for him to run, to escape, but there was no escape. The house was alive, and the clock was its beating heart. Tick, tick, tick. Robert closed his eyes, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The pressure inside his skull grew unbearable, as if the very fabric of reality was stretching, straining, about to snap. The ticking was the sound of that tension, the sound of everything coming apart. His thoughts, his world, his very existence. They were all tethered to that sound, locked in a countdown that he couldn't escape. The voice came again, insistent, as though it were speaking from the walls themselves. "It is almost midnight, Robert. The end of time is drawing near. You cannot escape it. No one can." He opened his eyes, staring at the clock on the mantel. The second hand was moving again, slowly but surely. It was a cruel trick. He had thought it had stopped, that there was some kind of reprieve. But now he saw the truth. The clock had never stopped. It had only been waiting for him to understand, waiting for him to know. The second hand was counting down, and with it, everything he had ever known. Tick, tick, tick. The house groaned under the weight of time, its walls creaking and cracking like bones in an old man's body. The windows rattled, the floorboards trembled. Robert could feel the very ground beneath him shift, as though the house was sinking into the earth, taking him with it. He looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. It was too late. There was no escaping the clock. His mind reeled, grasping at the edges of his sanity. He tried to think, tried to make sense of the madness that had consumed him. The voice, the ticking, the pressure, it was all connected. He had to understand it. He had to find the source. But how could he? How could he fight against something so ancient, so powerful that it could bend time itself to its will? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had to act. Robert stood, his legs unsteady, his breath shallow. The room swayed around him as if he were drifting, floating. He had to do something, anything, to stop the clock. But where could he go? What could he do? The whisper came again, softer now, almost pitying. "You think you can stop it. You think you can outrun time. Time is already inside you, Robert. You carry it with you always." Robert stumbled backward, his heart racing, his chest tight. He reached for the door, but before his hand could touch the knob, the room around him shifted. The walls seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm. The floor beneath him groaned, as though something beneath the house was stirring, waking. Something was coming. He turned back toward the room, toward the clock. It was too late. The seconds were slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Tick, tick, tick. The sound grew louder, faster, and in the silence that followed, Robert finally understood. The ticking was not just a sound, it was the pulse of fate, and he was running out of time. Robert's breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale shallow, each exhale like the last gasp of a man drowning in an unseen sea. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating him, the air thick with the stench of panic, and something darker, something he couldn't place. But he could feel it now, this malevolent presence, coiling through the house like a serpent. It was inside the walls. It was inside him. And it was waiting. The ticking continued, relentless, slow, steady, cruel in its precision. Tick, tick. Each second felt like a hammer to the skull, a brutal reminder that time was slipping away from him. Robert's hands trembled at his sides, his mind a swirl of thoughts he couldn't control. What was happening? Why was the clock alive? Why was he so trapped in this moment? Why did it feel like the very seconds themselves were alive, each one a tick closer to the abyss? He needed to understand. He needed to find the answer before time ran out. His mind screamed at him to do something, anything, but it was so hard to think. The room was spinning, and the ticking seemed to be coming from everywhere, surrounding him, drowning him in its ceaseless rhythm. It felt as if the sound was no longer just a clock, no longer just time. It was fate. And fate, Robert realized with a sickening twist in his gut, wasn't something that could be escaped. He stumbled to the window again, hoping against hope the sight of the outside world, anything, could offer him a sliver of salvation. He threw open the curtains, his hands slick with sweat, and stared out into the night. The street was empty. The world outside was still. But there was something wrong about it. The air, despite being cool, felt suffocating. It was thick with tension. The darkness outside was too dark, the shadows too long. Even the wind had ceased its restless howl. The world had gone silent, as if it too were waiting. Robert closed his eyes, the weight of it all crashing down on him. There was no escape, no release. The house, the clock, the shadows, they were all part of the same dark force. The countdown was real. Midnight wasn't just a time on a clock. It was an end. The end. Tick, tick, tick. He turned away from the window, his legs unsteady beneath him. He had to do something. There had to be some way to stop the clock, to break this cycle, to free himself from the grip of time. But the more he thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. The clock wasn't just counting down to midnight. It was counting down to his end, his final end. And nothing he did could change that. Then, as if on cue, the walls groaned. A low, rumbling sound, as though the house itself were waking from a deep slumber. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, a slow, unnatural tremor that made the floorboards creak. He heard a sound, faint at first, but growing louder, a scraping noise like claws against wood. It came from the walls. He froze, his heart hammering in his chest, his eyes wide with terror. The sound was unmistakable. He had heard it before. It was the sound of something alive. Scrape, scratch, scratch. Robert's breath caught in his throat, his body stiff with fear. He couldn't move, couldn't think. He was trapped in the room with whatever was lurking behind the walls. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, their edges lengthening, stretching toward him like hands, fingers beckoning, hungry for his soul. He had to escape. He had to leave before whatever was waiting in the dark claimed him. With shaking hands, he reached for the door handle, his fingers cold and slick with sweat. He twisted it, but the door refused to open. He slammed his shoulder into the wood, desperate, his pulse pounding in his throat. The door creaked, but it didn't give. He shoved again, harder, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house was locking him in. The clock above the mantel ticked louder now, faster. Its rhythm quickened, each second a drumbeat of doom, echoing in his mind, pulling him deeper into the suffocating darkness. The walls groaned again, louder this time, as if they were closing in on him. The air grew colder, and Robert's breath turned to mist in front of him, but it wasn't the cold of winter. No, this was something worse. It was the cold of death. He turned back to the clock, his eyes wide with frantic panic. The hands of the clock were moving faster now, the second hand racing toward midnight, the ticking becoming a deafening roar in his ears. He watched as the clock hands clicked, one tick at a time, drawing closer to the inevitable moment. Tick, tick, tick. You cannot stop it, the whisper came again, this time not from the walls or the shadows, but from within him. He felt it, crawling through his thoughts like a snake. The voice was familiar now, and the realization struck him like a lightning bolt. It was his voice. The ticking wasn't just coming from the clock, it was coming from him. His heartbeat, his soul, his very essence was a ticking clock, counting down to the moment when time would stop for him. It was too late. Tick, tick, tick. The clock above the mantel struck a final resounding chime. The sound reverberated through the house, echoing off the walls, rattling the windows, and then the room went silent. The walls, the floor, the very air, the ticking stopped. The silence was thick, suffocating. It pressed down on Robert's chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. The darkness grew, swallowing him whole. He felt the shift before he saw it. The room was no longer the same. It was darker now, colder. The house had changed. The walls, once solid, now seemed to be made of shadow, stretching, shifting, as if they were no longer bound by the laws of reality. Robert's heart raced, but the pounding was now the only sound he could hear. His own blood rushing in his ears, the final seconds ticking away. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with horror. And that's when he saw it, the shadow standing at the far corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form indistinct, blending with the darkness around it. But the eyes, those eyes burned through the dark, two hollow orbs glowing with an unnatural light. And in those eyes, Robert saw something worse than death. He saw the end of time. Tick, 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 and then silence. The silence in the room was oppressive, heavy, stifling. Robert's breath came in short gasps, the air thick with something that felt more like dread than oxygen. The darkness around him seemed to have weight, pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. His eyes locked on the shadow standing in the far corner of the room. The thing with the eyes, the hollow, glowing eyes. It was standing so still that it seemed to be part of the very walls, part of the house itself. The longer Robert stared, the more it seemed to grow, stretching upward, its shape becoming more defined, more solid. The eyes, however, never moved. They stayed locked on him, burning with a light that didn't belong in the darkness. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was maddening now, louder than ever, drowning out everything else. It wasn't just the clock anymore. It was in his skull, in his veins, in the very fabric of the room. The ticking was time itself, closing in, wrapping around him, tightening until he felt like he was choking on it. Robert's heartbeat thudded in his chest, each beat now in sync with the rhythmic ticking. The sound of it was more than just a reminder of his mortality. It was his mortality. It was the pulse of his life, slowly running out. The shadow moved then, impossibly fast, gliding across the floor like smoke. Robert didn't move. He couldn't. His legs felt like stone, his body frozen in place, trapped by the weight of the silence that followed the ticking. The shadow reached the center of the room, where the clock sat, and for a moment, Robert thought he could see it, see through it. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was something ancient, something alive. And then the voice came, software, so soft that Robert almost missed it. It was low, a rasping whisper in the back of his mind, like an echo of something he had forgotten. "It's too late," the voice said. Robert's stomach twisted. His throat tightened as he tried to speak, tried to scream, but his voice betrayed him. He couldn't find his words. The air had turned to thick tar in his lungs. and each breath felt like a desperate gasp for air beneath the weight of 100 years. The shadow was moving again, circling the clock. It seemed to grow with every pass, the darkness stretching like a hand reaching out, hungry for him. Its eyes never wavered, never blinked, just burned with a cold light that made Robert feel like he was being torn apart from the inside. Time. It was the key, the clock, the ticking. It wasn't just the sound of his inevitable death. It was a prison. Time had become his jailer, and it was slowly closing in on him. He tried to think, tried to grasp at the frayed edges of his mind, but the more he thought about it, the more his thoughts twisted into something he couldn't control. He had hoped that if he could escape, if he could break free of the house, maybe the clock would stop. Maybe time would relent, but it hadn't. The clock, Robert realized, had never been just a clock. It had never been about the seconds or the minutes. It had been about control, power. The shadow stopped moving, its eyes now locked on Robert, its shape becoming more solid. The light in the eyes flickered, and for the briefest moment Robert thought he saw something in them, a glimpse of his face, a reflection. It was distorted, twisted, as if he were looking into a cracked mirror. And then it hit him. The clock, the shadow, the ticking. It was all part of something much worse. Time wasn't just the ticking of a clock. Time was alive, and time wanted to consume him. The shadow stepped closer, the darkness folding around it like a cloak. Robert's body trembled, and he could feel the weight of every passing second pressing against him, crushing him. The clock ticked, louder, faster. Each second now felt like a violent push, a shove that brought him closer to the edge of something he couldn't see, something he couldn't understand. Tick, tick, tick. The shadow reached out. Robert tried to move, but his limbs were stiff, numb, as though the very air around him had frozen his body in place. His eyes were fixed on the shadow's hands, long, bony fingers that seemed to stretch and bend in unnatural ways. They reached for him, slow at first, then faster, until they were inches away. This was it. It was too late. He understood now. There was no escaping this, no running, no fighting. The clock had caught up with him. It had always been about time, his time, and now time was taking it back. The hands closed around his throat. A sharp, stabbing pain shot through his neck as he gasped for air. His vision blurred, his mind a haze of panic and terror. The shadow's fingers tightened, and for a brief moment Robert thought he heard the clock ticking again, louder than ever, a deafening roar. Tick, 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 and then all at once the ticking stopped. For one terrifying moment there was silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. Robert's body jerked as the shadow released him, and he crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, his heart thundering in his chest. The room was still, but everything was different now. The walls had lost their solidity, the air felt colder, thinner, and the darkness seemed to have swallowed up everything. He could feel it, the end. The shadow was gone, but Robert knew it was still there, lurking in the corners of the room, waiting. The clock had stopped ticking, but the end had already come. It had always been coming. Time wasn't just a ticking clock anymore. It was the pulse of life itself. The ticking had never been just a sound. It had been a countdown to this, to the end, to him. And as the room faded into the darkness, Robert understood. It wasn't the clock that was broken, it was time itself. Ethan had always been the curious sort, the kind of college student who'd wander away from the usual paths of study, who'd let his eyes wander over every corner of the campus, even the ones others didn't seem to notice. That was how he found it. He had been in the university's library one rainy afternoon, surrounded by the usual stacks of textbooks and journals, but his mind was elsewhere. The words on the pages in front of him swirled and blurred like smoke, as if even the weight of a university education was somehow less interesting than the mystery that had been gnawing at the edges of his thoughts for weeks. The rumors had started small. Whispers in the corners of the student union, faint murmurs in the hallway between classes. Strange things happening around the campus. The locked rooms that students had never seen open. The old building at the edge of the campus that was rarely talked about, but still stood, with its windows dark like eyes, staring into the soul of the university. No one could confirm it, but Ethan had caught enough strange glances and half-forgotten words to start wondering. One afternoon, after his last lecture, he found himself standing before a door in the basement of the main library, a door that was always locked. He had walked past it a dozen times before, a heavy door of ancient wood with brass hinges that had long since lost their shine. He had never thought much of it, assuming it led to storage or some forgotten part of the campus no one cared to use. But today something was different. The door was slightly ajar. Ethan hesitated at first, his hand resting on the cool metal of the handle, but a strange compulsion pulled at him. The air felt different around him, as though the hallway had somehow changed in the time it had taken him to reach it. It was too quiet. And that whisper, faint but urgent, seemed to come from behind the door, beckoning him closer. He pushed it open. Beyond the door was a staircase, narrow and dark, spiraling downward into the gloom. The air smelled musty, like old paper and forgotten time, the kind of smell you might expect to find in a place that had been untouched for decades, centuries even. His heart beat a little faster as he descended, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and he felt a strange chill run up his spine. At the bottom of the stairs, a long hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by a single, flickering light hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in shelves, rows and rows of them, stacked with books that looked ancient, their leather covers cracked and worn by time. There was something unsettling about them, as if they had been waiting for him, beckoning him to come closer. Ethan's fingers itched. He hadn't planned on being here, hadn't even thought to look for anything in particular. But now that he was in this forbidden space, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was drawing him forward. The library was buried deep beneath the school, hidden from the world, like it had been intentionally forgotten. And yet here it was, just waiting for someone to stumble upon it. The shelves seemed to stretch endlessly, each book placed with meticulous care, even though dust had gathered thick on the covers, as though no one had disturbed them for years, decades, maybe longer. There was a weight in the air, an ancient stillness that made Ethan feel like he was trespassing in a place not meant for the living. He walked along the rows of shelves, running his fingers over the spines of the books, each one seeming to call to him with a voice he could almost hear. The titles were in a language he didn't recognize, their letters twisted and curling like strange, forgotten symbols. There were no windows down here, no signs of life at all, just the oppressive silence and the weight of time bearing down on him. Then at the far end of the room, he saw it. A book, unlike any of the others. It sat on a pedestal, illuminated by the dim light hanging from the ceiling, its cover dark and foreboding, like the pages themselves had been soaked in shadow. The title was embossed in silver lettering, but it was in a language he couldn't read. The letters shimmered as if alive, and an unease settled in his gut. A chill ran down Ethan's spine, and for a moment he considered turning back. Something about the book, about the way it seemed to call to him, pulling him toward it, was wrong. But curiosity got the better of him. After all, he had come this far. He stepped forward, his fingers trembling as he reached out and lifted the book from its pedestal. It was heavier than he expected, and as he held it, the feeling that something was watching him intensified. He glanced over his shoulder, but the room was as still as it had been before, silent, empty. Ethan opened the cover. The pages were old and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. The words were strange, words he didn't know but somehow he understood. As he read the first line, he felt the floor beneath him shift, as if the very foundation of the building had groaned in response. The room around him seemed to close in, the walls bending inward. His breath quickened. He read on, his mind spinning as the words began to take shape, revealing a story that felt oddly familiar, yet distant. The tale spoke of an ancient force, something old and powerful, hidden beneath the earth, waiting for a time when it would be unleashed upon the world. And in the text there were clues, cryptic instructions about the world beyond this room, the world that was starting to warp, starting to change with each page he turned. At first, Ethan thought it was just his imagination. But as he turned to the second page, the world around him seemed to flicker, as if reality itself were trembling, unsure of its place. The faint hum of a distant machine, the creaking of the library's old timbers, all of it seemed to blur. And then the change came. A faint, chilling breeze swept through the room, and the shadows seemed to stretch and deepen. The floor beneath Ethan's feet creaked, and the bookshelves on the far side of the room began to tremble. He heard a low groan, not from the building, but from somewhere else, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to come from the very earth itself. Ethan closed the book and looked around, panic rising in his chest. Had he done something? Had the words in that book changed the world somehow? The shadows in the corners of the room grew longer, darker, and the silence became too quiet. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. His heart pounded in his chest as the feeling of being watched intensified. There was something else in the room now, something that hadn't been there before, something that was alive. And that's when Ethan realized the truth. The book wasn't just a book, it wasn't just a story, it was a doorway. The moment Ethan closed the book, he thought the world would return to normal. The oppressive silence in the room, the eerie chill in the air. It all seemed so wrong. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. But when he glanced around, he realized the air itself had shifted. The shadows in the room seemed darker, the light more distant, as though the room had somehow contracted, pulled into itself. The musty smell of old paper was stronger now, almost suffocating, and the walls, those ancient towering shelves, seemed to loom closer, bending and warping as if they were alive, as if they were waiting for something. Ethan took a step back, his feet unsteady, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned the book over in his hands, the heavy leather feeling warm against his skin, an odd heat radiating from it. A deep, hollow ache settled in the pit of his stomach as he ran his fingers over the cracked spine, unable to look away. The pages were still open, still waiting, but he couldn't bring himself to turn another. His mind screamed at him to leave, to put it back on the pedestal and run for the stairs. But he couldn't. Something tugged at him from inside the book, an unrelenting pull that seemed to bypass reason altogether. The words on the pages seemed to flicker in his vision, like the world itself was vibrating to their rhythm. A low, rasping whisper drifted from the pages, a sound that felt both too close and too far away at the same time. It beckoned him. It wanted him to know. Ethan's fingers moved of their own accord, flipping back to the page he had last read. And there, in the dim light of the basement, the words on the page shimmered, rearranging themselves like living creatures. They began to change. The story, the cryptic tale of something ancient and dark, now appeared as though it were alive, stretching and bending with an unnatural fluidity. The walls are closing in. The words felt cold, colder than the room. Ethan blinked hard, rubbing his eyes, but they didn't disappear. They were still there, still growing, spreading like ink on paper, as if they were reaching beyond the edges of the page. His breath quickened. The temperature in the room dropped another degree, and he could see his own breath hanging in the air before him like a mist. A sharp noise broke the stillness. The floor beneath him groaned, the old wood creaking, echoing through the room. It was as though the entire building was shifting, as though the very foundation of the library was bending under some invisible weight. Ethan's mind raced. Was this the book's doing? Or had something else changed? Had he awakened something? His skin crawled, every nerve in his body screaming at him to run. He stumbled backward, clutching the book to his chest like a lifeline, but as he turned to make his way toward the stairs, he froze. The shadows. They weren't shadows anymore. They moved, shifting and coiling like smoke, but they had no source, no light to cast them. They began to spread across the floor, creeping like slow ink stains, stretching toward him, undulating in the corners of the room. He could hear them now, faint whispers, a language he didn't understand, but it didn't matter. The sound made his teeth ache. His head throbbed with the pressure of it. The whispers were inside him now, seeping into his mind. The shelves, too, seemed to have changed. They were no longer just empty bookshelves. They pulsed with a strange energy, the book's spines glowing faintly. The ancient tomes, now more than just collections of paper and ink, seemed to have come to life in the darkness. The air felt thicker, as if something was pressing against his chest, suffocating him. A cold wave of realization hit him. Whatever was happening, it was because of the book. He had opened it. He had unleashed something, some ancient power, hidden deep within the pages, something that was no longer content to stay trapped. Ethan snapped the book shut with a violent jerk, the sound of the pages slamming together echoing through the room. The whispers stopped. The shadows halted their advance. For a fleeting moment he thought he had won. He thought it was over. But then came the sound, a low, guttural growl rising from deep within the floor itself. Ethan's heart stopped. The floorboards beneath him vibrated, the wood warping like it was being pulled from within. He stepped back, his breath shallow, his mind racing. The growl intensified. It was closer now. Too close. Ethan spun around, looking for an escape, but the walls had already closed in. The hallway was gone. The basement was gone. The library itself was gone. He was surrounded by darkness, trapped within a space that felt wrong. Alive, as though the room itself were breathing with him. The shadows were thicker now, darker, swirling like smoke, and from the depths of the dark, something moved. Something was coming. The whispering had returned, but this time it wasn't just whispers. The voices were clearer now, louder, an angry chant of syllables he couldn't understand, twisting and intertwining. They were rising, reaching toward him, and the floor beneath him continued to shift, pulling him closer to the heart of the darkness. He staggered back, trying to get away from it, but there was no way out. The room was suffocating, the walls pressed in, the shadows closed on him from every side. And then from behind him he heard it, a single, soft thump. He turned. A book, from the shelf to his left, had fallen to the floor. It was lying open, the pages fluttering as if caught by an unseen wind. Ethan's breath hitched. He couldn't stop himself. The pull, that unbearable pull, that whisper. It was stronger now. His legs moved toward the book without his permission, his fingers trembling as they reached down to pick it up. The air seemed to crackle around him. The book's cover was ancient, its edges worn by time, and as his fingers touched the yellowed pages, he felt a jolt of coldness shoot up his arm. There was no turning back. He opened the book. The pages began to write themselves. The letters, sharp and jagged, slithered across the pages as if they were alive, bending and twisting into shapes that didn't belong in this world. Ethan could see the letters moving, flowing, changing the very air around him. He didn't know what he was reading, but it didn't matter. He felt the world shifting. The room itself was bending, warping, and then the world disappeared. Ethan blinked, his eyes struggling to focus, but it was no use. The room was gone. Everything he had known, the musty basement of the library, the dark corners, the shelves of ancient books, the whispering shadows, had dissolved into something far worse. He was no longer standing in a place that made sense. The ground beneath his feet wasn't solid. It was shifting, like the floor was made of quicksand or some kind of liquid that had forgotten how to stay still. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, like the air around him had thickened, turned to mud. He opened his mouth to call out, to scream, but no sound came. His throat was dry, suffocating him from the inside, like his very body was rejecting his attempts to exist in this new reality. There was no longer any sense of time, no clocks, no ticking, no rhythm, just the deep, pulsating throb of something ancient, alive, pressing against his skin, suffocating him. Everything was dark, and yet not completely. Faint, sickly light radiated from some unseen source, casting long, crooked shadows that reached out like fingers, grasping at his feet, pulling him in, dragging him further into the dark abyss. Help! His voice was a raspy whisper, lost in the oppressive silence that enveloped him. He could feel the floor beneath his shoes again, solid, but only barely. The strange substance beneath him seemed to squirm as he moved, as though it wasn't just the earth that was alive, it was him that was being changed. The book was still in his hands. He hadn't let it go. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the weight of it, like a talisman, like it was keeping him anchored to whatever shred of reality remained. Maybe it was because deep inside him he knew that somehow it was the only way out of this. He flipped open the pages again. The words inside were still twisting, still alive, but now they seemed more coherent, more demanding. The letters stretched across the page like tendrils, as though they were trying to wrap themselves around his mind. He could feel the words pushing against the walls of his skull, trying to tear their way into him, but he couldn't stop reading. His hands, shaking with terror, forced his fingers to turn the pages. It was as though the book had a life of its own, as though it was drawing him deeper into its cursed embrace. The world changes with every page you turn. Ethan stopped. His fingers hovered over the page, his heart racing as the words seemed to burn into him. The sentence wasn't just an observation, it was a command. He didn't know what it meant, but he could feel it in the pit of his stomach, an awful weight bearing down on him. There was something insidious about this place, about the book, about the way the walls of this nightmare seemed to close in around him. As his eyes traced the pages, something stirred in the darkness, something that had been watching him, waiting. A low hum, almost imperceptible, vibrated through the air, as though the room itself was alive, as though the room itself had been pulled from the pages of the cursed book. What is this place? Ethan didn't have time to answer his own question. The air shifted again. Something moved. Something watched him. His breath quickened. He could feel the presence now, not just in the corners of his vision, but in the very marrow of his bones. It was not a presence that could be seen, not really. It was something older, something that didn't exist in his world, but it was there. He could feel it pressing in on him. The darkness became thicker, suffocating, and then a faint, guttural whisper filled the space, too soft to make out, but unmistakable in its intent. His body reacted before his mind could. He shoved the book back into his chest, hands trembling as if the pages were burning him. He looked around frantically. The air had gone cold, freezing like ice had poured into the room and swallowed him whole. He could see his breath now, thick and white, but it didn't feel like winter. It felt wrong. The light, that strange and sickly glow, dimmed, but not in the way it should have. It faded, yes, but it didn't go away. It seemed to get darker, but somehow it still illuminated the space in the most unnatural way. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, crawling along the floor like monstrous creatures with a life of their own. They moved toward him, slow and deliberate, as though they had plans of their own, as though they were watching him. They're waiting. Ethan's heart thundered in his chest. He wasn't sure how he knew that, but it was the only thing that made sense in this world that no longer seemed to obey the rules of nature or physics. The shadows were waiting for something, something he couldn't see, something that had been awakened by his reading. With every breath he took, the air seemed to grow heavier, more suffocating. A cold, slick sweat began to break out across his forehead. He could feel his mind fraying, the edges of his reality beginning to snap apart as if it were being pulled in every direction. The whispers that had once been distant, unintelligible, now began to speak more clearly. They sounded like 1,000 voices, overlapping, their words indistinct yet oddly familiar. They were speaking to him, calling to him. He raised his eyes, looking into the depths of the darkness before him. There were shapes in it now, vague forms, indistinct but there. Moving, reaching toward him. They moved like shadows, but they weren't shadows. There was something more to them, something inhuman. He couldn't focus on them too long. His mind refused to comprehend what they were. The growl came again, the low, menacing sound that had rattled him earlier. It wasn't just coming from one direction anymore. It surrounded him. Then, through the haze of his panic, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A soft click. He turned sharply. The floor beneath him cracked, splitting open like a wound. A crevice appeared, stretching wide, as though something was pushing upward from below. He took a step back, and then another, his body frozen in dread. The cracks in the floor continued to widen, the sound of tearing wood and splitting stone filling the air. Out of the cracks, something slithered. Long, coiling tendrils of darkness, reaching up like fingers trying to claw their way into the world. It wasn't just the room that was shifting now, it was the entire reality. The world was bending under the weight of the book's curse, warping and twisting into something unspeakable. Ethan had to move, he had to escape, but the darkness closed in and the floor cracked further, swallowing him whole. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the crack in the floor spread wider, its jagged edges seeming to pulse and throb like an open wound. The room, the world, was coming apart at the seams. He felt the floor beneath him dip, sinking deeper as if the very foundation was being torn from under him. The dark tendrils reaching from the fissure were closer now, their shadowy fingers twitching, pulling with a relentless hunger, as though they were eager to consume everything. He backed away, every instinct screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The walls pressed in from every side, tightening around him like the maw of some monstrous beast, ready to snap shut at any moment. The very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when it could devour him too. His head spun with the intensity of it all, his mind fighting to hold on to some semblance of reality, as the world twisted around him. Then came the sound, the low, rattling growl of something moving just beyond the edges of his perception. The noise seemed to vibrate through him, reverberating deep into his bones, as though the very earth beneath him was alive and aware. The shadows seemed to pulse with the growl, the flickering light from an unknown source casting grotesque shapes across the room. Ethan spun on his heel, looking for an exit, but there was none. The basement had transformed. It had become something other than a mere room. It was a dark, shifting pit, a void that threatened to swallow him whole. He ran. His legs moved faster than he could think, but each step he took seemed to bring him no closer to the stairs. They were gone, erased from the landscape of this nightmare world. He stumbled, falling forward, and his hands scraped across the cold, clammy stone of the floor. But he couldn't get a grip. His fingers slid, the ground slick beneath him like the surface of a dark, oily pool. His mind screamed in protest. The whispers grew louder now, clearer, no longer fragmented and indistinct. The voices seemed to blend together in a maddening symphony of sound, their words now easily recognizable but still incomprehensible. It wasn't language, not the kind he understood, but it felt like language. The words tugged at his sanity, their meaning slipping just out of reach, taunting him. "It's too late for you, Ethan." The voice was clear now, his name spoken with an almost tender cruelty, as if the thing whispering it had known him for a lifetime. The shadows seemed to crawl along the floor, reaching for his feet, pulling at his ankles. The ground, still shifting beneath him, was beginning to twist, spinning like a vortex. He heard a sound, shuffling, scraping, slow but deliberate. His pulse spiked as he looked up, eyes darting across the room, scanning the shifting shadows. The book, still clutched in his trembling hands, felt hot, like it was burning his palms, but he couldn't stop himself from holding on to it. It was as if the book wanted to be here, wanted to drag him deeper into this horror. And then, with a shock that nearly knocked the air from his lungs, he saw it. From the depths of the darkness, something moved, a shape barely visible at first, materializing from the void. It was a figure, tall and thin, draped in black. The figure stood there, unmoving, its presence heavy in the air. Ethan's eyes locked onto the figure, his body frozen in place as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The figure tilted its head, and for the briefest moment he saw its eyes, glowing, burning with an otherworldly light. "It's not alone." The thought sliced through his mind like a razor. As if on cue, more shapes began to emerge from the shadows, tall, dark figures draped in black, with glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. They were everywhere now, surrounding him, closing in from every direction. Ethan's breath hitched in his chest as his mind screamed to escape, but his body refused to obey. The darkness was everywhere now, choking the air, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into its folds. One of the figures moved toward him. Its face was obscured by a hood, but there was something about the way it moved that was unmistakable. It was coming closer, each step slow and deliberate, the air growing colder with each passing moment. Ethan wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was dry, constricted, his vision blurred as panic set in. He was trapped. There was no escape. The shadows closed in tighter, and the glowing eyes of the figures seemed to pierce him to the core. A new sound now, faint at first, but growing louder, a ticking, rhythmic and insistent, like the heartbeat of some ancient creature. It echoed through the room, reverberating in the darkness. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, bouncing off the walls, surrounding him in a way that felt personal. It was a sound that tugged at his very soul, as if it were counting down to something terrible, something inevitable. The clock is ticking. The figure before him raised a hand, and Ethan could see the skeletal fingers twitch, as if it were reaching for him. But the figure's hand wasn't the worst of it. No, what truly chilled him to the bone was what he saw behind it, a mass of writhing black tendrils stretching out from the darkness, crawling toward him like a living thing, each one twisting and turning in search of its prey. The room began to spin. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps, his head spinning as the figures closed in on him. The floor was no longer solid, the ground now a swirling mass of blackness like a pit, a vortex pulling him down into its endless depths. The ticking grew louder, more insistent, a maddening rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with his heartbeat. It was so loud now that he could feel it in his chest, vibrating in his very bones. Then the shadows reached him. Cold, clammy fingers closed around his ankles, tugging him down. He screamed. Finally, the sound tearing from his throat, but it was swallowed by the darkness. The world tilted again, spinning uncontrollably. The shadows were pulling him under, dragging him into the abyss, the glowing eyes above him flashing like stars in the night sky. And as the darkness consumed him, a final thought crossed his mind. It was too late. Ethan's screams were swallowed whole by the abyss, the darkness pressing down on him like a blanket of cold. His body was dragged, pulled against his will, as though the very ground beneath him was hungry, eager to devour him. His limbs felt like lead, his strength draining with every passing moment, and no matter how hard he fought, no matter how he struggled, the shadows held him fast, refusing to let go. His throat burned with the effort of his scream, but it was futile. The very air itself seemed to steal his voice, choking him on his fear. He wasn't just being dragged through the floor anymore. No, the world had gone beyond that. Now he was falling into a place that was not part of the world he knew. There was no ground beneath him, no solid form, just the endless, eternal descent into an infinite void where time and space had no meaning. The ticking of the clock had grown unbearable, an unrelenting, chaotic pulse that filled the very air he breathed. It was a sound that seemed to echo through the caverns of his mind, amplifying every moment of his terror. The rhythm had become part of him, like a heartbeat that he couldn't escape, each tick a reminder of the thing that awaited him at the end. And then, there it was, a light flickering weakly in the darkness. At first, it was distant, just a small, flickering speck of illumination, but as Ethan fell, it grew closer, brighter, blinding him in its intensity. He had no control, no sense of agency as he tumbled toward it, but the sight of it was an anchor in the swirling chaos, something he could cling to, something that promised escape. But the closer he got, the more it became clear this was no sanctuary. The light wasn't light at all, it was fire, a raging, searing inferno, an explosion of flame that ripped through the blackness, lighting the void in an angry, painful glow. It felt alive, pulsing with a violent energy that seemed to beat in time with the ticking of the clock, matching its frantic rhythm. Ethan was too late. It was too late to stop. As he tumbled closer, his arms outstretched, the fire twisted in on itself, opening into something far worse. A gaping, dark mouth, a blackened maw waiting to swallow him whole. And inside it, the figures from the darkness, those same glowing-eyed, shadowy beings, emerged, their faces twisted and contorted, half human, half something else. The words they spoke were incomprehensible, guttural, their voices like nails on a chalkboard, scraping against his nerves, making his head spin. The world was breaking apart. The ground beneath him shattered, splintering into millions of shards that scattered like glass across the void. He had no foothold, no way to stop his descent. The figures were reaching for him, their skeletal hands stretching out like claws, grasping, pulling. They were close now, their cold touch grazing his skin, sending icy tendrils of dread curling into his bones. Then, the book. Ethan realized with a sudden jolt of understanding that he was still clutching the damn thing. His fingers were frozen around it, his hands glued to the pages as if it had become part of him. It had changed him. He could feel it now, a part of him that was no longer human, a part of him that belonged to the darkness. He opened the book again. His eyes, wide with terror, scanned the pages. The words that had once danced in front of him now seemed to mock him, their meaning clear but incomprehensible. Each sentence was like a chain, wrapping itself around his heart, tightening with every breath. You cannot escape. The words bled from the page, twisting, writhing like serpents. They surged toward him, crawling into his skin, digging into his veins. Ethan felt the presence of the words inside him now, felt them taking root in his very soul, planting themselves deep within his psyche. It wasn't just the book that was alive, it was him too. He had become part of the story, a part of the curse that had been written long before he ever picked it up. And there, in that burning maw, the final truth struck him. The book wasn't just telling a story, it was the story. And now Ethan was a part of it, a page in its dark, eternal cycle, a character doomed to be rewritten over and over again in an endless loop. His body convulsed as the words surged through him, taking him under, filling him up. His vision blurred, the fire fading into blackness, and for a moment there was peace. Silence. No ticking, no darkness, no shadows. But it was an illusion. The story never ended. The ticking began again. The fire burned anew. Ethan was no longer Ethan. He was a name, a face, a memory wrapped in darkness, a part of the story that would continue without end. And somewhere far away, someone would pick up the book once again, and the cycle would begin again. For there was no escape from the forbidden library. The rain had begun falling hours ago, a steady, relentless downpour that seemed to bleed the world of its color. A tiny old train station stood alone in the darkness, its flickering overhead lights casting strange, jagged shadows on the cracked concrete platform. Far away, she could hear the mournful sound of the wind whistling through the rusting tracks, the occasional clap of thunder punctuating the silence. Mia stood there, drenched, her thin jacket doing little to shield her from the biting cold. She had been waiting for the last 30 minutes, but the train she was supposed to catch had never arrived. There were no signs of life here, except for the occasional rustle of the trees in the distance. It felt like the entire world had vanished, leaving her alone in this desolate, forgotten corner of nowhere. She glanced down at her phone for what seemed like the 100th time. No signal. Of course there wasn't. This was exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find yourself stranded when you were trying to get home from a late meeting, running on fumes and sheer willpower. It had all seemed so simple, just another trip, another train ride, but now, standing here, she felt the weight of the night pressing down on her, suffocating the air with something unnerving. Mia pulled her collar up, trying to block the cold, her mind racing with thoughts of why the train hadn't arrived. She checked the time again, frowning. It was well past midnight now, and if the train didn't show soon, she would be forced to make the 2-hour walk to the nearest town. A chill ran down her spine as she considered that option. Darkness here felt wrong, as though it was hiding something that shouldn't be out in the open. A distant rumble of thunder shook the air, and Mia glanced over her shoulder instinctively. as if expecting to see someone or something behind her. Nothing. The station was as empty as it had been when she first arrived, the benches deserted, the tracks abandoned. But then, just as her unease was starting to turn into something more palpable, a strange sound reached her ears. It was distant at first, barely audible over the rain, but it grew louder with each passing second until it was undeniable. The unmistakable sound of a train. Mia whipped around, her heart skipping a beat. The tracks, once empty, were now alive with the presence of something approaching. Her pulse quickened and she squinted into the distance. A light, barely visible at first, blinked through the rain. It was small but growing brighter, the hum of the train's wheels clicking along the tracks like a heartbeat. It shouldn't have been there. The train was late, wasn't it? She had checked the schedule. The next train wasn't due for at least another half hour. She took a step forward, her shoes slapping against the wet pavement, straining to make out the shape of the train as it came closer. The headlights of the locomotive emerged from the mist, casting a sickly yellow glow across the platform. But something about the train wasn't right. The closer it got, the stranger it seemed. The engine looked old, no, older than old, like something straight out of a bygone era. The kind of train you might expect to see in a black and white photo from the 1940s, or even earlier. It was massive, its dark silhouette dominating the platform, but it moved as silently as a shadow. Mia froze. A ripple of fear ran through her chest. The train came closer, its speed unsettlingly fast. There were no announcements over the station speakers, no warning. The train simply appeared. She wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to approach it. There was something magnetic about it, something she couldn't explain. It was as though the train was calling to her, beckoning her with an invisible hand, offering an escape from the suffocating darkness around her. Without thinking, Mia moved forward, her feet crunching on the wet gravel as she drew nearer. The train screeched to a halt, the sound reverberating in her bones. The doors opened immediately without so much as a second's hesitation, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "Are you getting on?" The voice was deep, rough, and surprisingly warm considering the eerie stillness of the night. Mia turned to face the speaker. Standing at the open door was a man, a conductor, if she had to guess. He was tall, with a broad, imposing frame, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, a dark suit with brass buttons, and a weathered cap perched on his head. His face was partially hidden in the shadow, but she could make out his sharp features, his high cheekbones, the thick, dark stubble along his jawline, the cold, steely eyes that looked right through her. The train behind him seemed to pulse, the light from within flickering in rhythm with her racing heart. I don't know." Mia hesitated, suddenly unsure. She had no idea who this man was, or why the train had arrived so suddenly, so late, with no warning. Should she get on? Was this some kind of mistake? "Don't worry about it," the conductor said, his voice calm, almost soothing. "It's safe. You'll be fine." His words had an odd power over her, as if they were meant to reassure her, to convince her that everything was okay. But something in the air, something in his eyes, told her that he wasn't being completely truthful. The station was silent again, the distant sound of rain beating against the roof of the shelter, the only noise left. Mia couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something she couldn't understand. But despite her better judgment, she found herself taking a step toward the train. "Just a quick ride," the conductor continued, his lips curling into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You'll want to see where it takes you." Without waiting for her response, he stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. For a moment, Mia stood there, staring at the open door, the light spilling out from within. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind. What if this was some kind of trap? What if the train was haunted? What if she had just stepped into some nightmare she could never escape? But then she remembered how tired she was. She remembered the long hours, the frustration, the uncertainty of standing alone in the rain at this forgotten station in the middle of nowhere. The train seemed like a ticket to something, anything other than the oppressive isolation that hung over her. With a deep breath, Mia stepped forward. The moment she crossed the threshold, she felt a shift, a strange sensation, like the air around her had thickened, pressing in on all sides. She glanced up at the conductor, who gave her another smile, his lips curling just a little too wide for comfort. "Take a seat," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper now. "We're about to depart." The door slammed shut behind her with an unsettling finality. Mia's heart leapt into her throat as the train jerked forward, slowly at first, then picking up speed as it hurtled into the night. The world outside the window became a blur of rain and shadow, the station disappearing from view, and Mia was left with only the sound of the train's wheels and her own racing heartbeat. For a brief moment, she felt a sense of calm wash over her, until the train's interior came into focus. The passengers. The train rattled as it sped down the tracks, the rhythmic sound of the wheels against the rails creating a haunting backdrop to the silence that filled the interior. Mia's breath came in shallow bursts as she took in her surroundings. The car was dimly lit, the flickering light casting long, twisting shadows across the old, worn upholstery. The seats were plush but faded, their fabric a dull shade of maroon, stained with age and neglect. She felt as though she had stepped into another time, something out of place, out of sync. At first, she saw no one. The car seemed entirely empty, save for her and the conductor, who had disappeared into the other end of the train after he closed the door behind her. But as the train continued to roll forward, the first passenger emerged from the shadows. A woman. She was sitting in a seat near the far end of the car, staring out the window with a fixed gaze, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She wore an old-fashioned dress, the kind that looked like it belonged in a history book, with lace and ruffles that seemed out of place for the time. Her face was pale, and her lips were painted a deep, unsettling red, but it was her eyes, cold, lifeless, that caught Mia's attention. For a moment, Mia wondered if she had imagined the woman, but then the figure turned her head, slowly, almost unnaturally, to meet Mia's gaze. A shiver ran down Mia's spine. The woman didn't smile, didn't acknowledge her in any meaningful way. Instead, she simply stared, her eyes hollow and distant, as though Mia were just another part of the night, a blur that wasn't worth acknowledging. Mia quickly looked away, her heart beginning to pound again, as the oppressive silence of the train pressed down on her. She felt suddenly aware of how alone she was in this strange, isolated space. The train was moving too fast now, and the world outside the windows was nothing but a black void. But it wasn't just the darkness that unsettled her. It was the stillness inside the car. There were no sounds of chatter, no quiet murmurs, no rustling of bags or shuffling of feet. Nothing. Mia took a deep breath and turned to look down the aisle, searching for any sign of life. There were more passengers now, at least a dozen seated in the car, their faces blurred and indistinct, each one staring ahead in eerie silence. They all seemed to be in their own worlds, trapped in a kind of dreamlike stupor. Some were dressed in clothing from an older era, 1920s maybe, or even earlier, but others appeared more modern, their faces a mixture of confusion and resignation. She felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The air inside the train was thick, heavy with something that felt almost suffocating. The temperature had dropped noticeably, the cold seeping into her bones. She tugged her jacket tighter around her shoulders, trying to ward off the chill, but it didn't help. The darkness outside the windows seemed to press in closer, making the car feel smaller, more claustrophobic. She noticed something else then, something even more unsettling. None of the passengers moved, not a single one. They sat completely still, not shifting in their seats, not adjusting their position. The only movement came from the faint twitch of their eyes as they stared at nothing, lost in some strange trance. Mia swallowed hard, her throat dry. She felt the need to scream, to shout, to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. She could only stare back at the motionless figures, her mind racing for some kind of explanation. The air seemed to grow heavier still, and Mia took an unsteady step down the aisle, her shoes tapping softly against the old wood. As she passed each passenger, she couldn't help but look closer at their faces. Most of them were middle-aged or older, their faces pale and lined with age, but their expressions were vacant, as though they were staring at something far beyond the confines of the train. Some wore hats or scarves, others simply sat motionless, their hands resting at their sides. One passenger, however, caught her eye. A man sitting near the middle of the car, his head slightly tilted, his eyes wide open, but unfocused. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in a labored rhythm. But there was something strange about his gaze. It was as if he wasn't truly looking at anything at all. His eyes darted around erratically, his hands clenched tightly against his thighs. He seemed agitated, as though he was trapped in some kind of nightmare, but unable to escape. Mia's pulse quickened. She took another step forward, closer to the man, her breath catching in her throat. What was happening here? Why were these people so still? Why didn't anyone seem to notice her? "Excuse me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the train. She reached out a tentative hand toward the man, but before she could touch him, his head snapped to the side with a suddenness that made Mia's heart leap into her throat. He stared at her, directly at her, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and desperation. And then, in a voice that was barely a rasp, he spoke. "You shouldn't be here." His words were fragmented, like he was struggling to find the right ones, but they were unmistakable. "They'll take you too." Mia recoiled, her breath catching in her throat. The man's face was twisted in agony, his eyes pleading as if he were begging her to leave, to turn back. But before she could ask him what he meant, he abruptly turned away, his body stiffening, his eyes once again vacant. His chest rose and fell rapidly, but his expression remained the same, empty, distant. Mia felt a wave of panic wash over her. What was happening? Who were these people? Where was this train going? Suddenly a loud screech filled the car, a sharp, discordant sound that made Mia wince. She covered her ears instinctively, but the noise only grew louder, more intense, until it felt like her entire body was vibrating with it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she staggered backward, her eyes wide with terror. The lights flickered, and the passengers, every single one of them, jerked as though they were coming back to life, but their movements were unnatural, stiff, mechanical. Their eyes all turned to her at once, their gazes empty and hollow, as if they were staring at a thing they couldn't quite understand. A low, guttural murmur rippled through the train, a whispering sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "You shouldn't be here," a voice rasped from behind her. Mia spun around, her heart in her throat, but the aisle was empty. She was trapped on a train with people who were anything but ordinary. The train lurched suddenly and Mia's stomach dropped. She grabbed the nearest seat, her fingers shaking as she steadied herself. But no matter how much she tried to convince herself that this was all just a bad dream, the cold, oppressive air, the motionless passengers, and the eerie silence told her otherwise. Something was very wrong, and she was getting closer to finding out exactly what. The train lurched again, as though it had just crossed some invisible threshold, shaking the entire car with a violent jerk that sent Mia tumbling into the seat across from her. Her heart was pounding now, thudding loudly in her chest, the sound echoing through her ears like a drumbeat. She barely managed to catch herself as the strange train seemed to accelerate, picking up speed with no visible tracks ahead, no sign of where it was headed. The passengers, still motionless, continued to stare, their hollow eyes fixed on her, as if she were the only living thing in this macabre, dreamlike procession. Every one of them was the same, cold, unblinking, unfeeling. But it was impossible to ignore the overwhelming sense of dread that had settled over the car like a suffocating fog. Mia's pulse raced as she sat there, clutching the armrest, her fingers white-knuckled with fear. The lights above flickered again, casting the train car into an even darker gloom. The hum of the wheels against the track seemed to grow louder, more ominous, as if the train itself were alive and breathing, groaning under the weight of its journey. The outside world was gone. There was only the darkness beyond the windows, a black void that seemed to stretch on forever. She couldn't remember how long she had been on this train now, but the clock on the far wall had stopped moving. The hands were frozen at exactly 12:03 a.m., as though time itself had given up. A soft voice interrupted the silence. "Not what you think," the voice whispered from behind her. Mia spun around, her body jolting with shock, but no one was there. The seats were still occupied by the same empty-eyed passengers, their faces expressionless, their hands still folded in their laps. Yet that voice, it wasn't in her head, it was real. "Please," she whispered, her voice shaky, her breath short. "Who's there?" The voice came again, this time louder, closer. "Don't trust them. They're not what they seem." Mia's eyes darted around the car, but she couldn't see anyone. The conductor had disappeared after she boarded, and now it was as if the train had swallowed everyone whole, leaving only these strange people behind. Her head was spinning, her mind struggling to catch up with the strange reality she had found herself in. Suddenly a loud thud echoed from the rear of the train, and Mia's heart skipped a beat. The sound was followed by an odd, soft, scraping noise, like something dragging along the floor. She stood up too quickly, her knees unsteady beneath her, and instinctively moved toward the back of the car. As she walked, her footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, amplified by the eerie silence that hung over the train, like a thick, suffocating fog. The scraping sound grew louder, closer, until she could feel it reverberating through her bones. It was coming from the very last car, the one that was sealed off by a thick, rusty door, one that had been locked when she first boarded. A sense of dread gnawed at the pit of her stomach as she reached the door. The scraping sound had now turned into something else, a faint tapping, as though someone was trying to get her attention from the other side. Her fingers hovered over the cold metal handle, but she hesitated. There was something so deeply wrong about that sound, about the eerie silence that enveloped everything else. But despite every rational instinct telling her to walk away, to turn back, Mia's hand gripped the handle and twisted it. The door opened with a horrible screech, as though it had been waiting for her to touch it. The air that poured into the hallway was thick and stale, with the unmistakable scent of mildew and decay. Mia stepped through, her breath catching as she peered into the next car. The lights here were dimmer, flickering erratically as the car swayed gently, and the occupants inside were more unsettling than the ones she had left behind. There were no empty seats in this car. Each one was occupied by a figure hunched over, their faces obscured by shadows or hooded cloaks. Their hands were clasped in front of them, their heads bowed as though in prayer or some kind of ritualistic trance. Mia took a step forward, her mind whirling with questions. What was going on? Who were these people? And more importantly, where was this train going? The tap-tap-tapping had started again, but now it was coming from one of the cloaked figures, the one sitting closest to her. Mia hesitated, her heart racing as she approached the person, the rhythmic tapping growing louder and louder with each step. She stopped just a few feet away from the figure. The figure's head tilted slightly as if acknowledging her presence, but it didn't move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as though it were waiting for something. Mia felt a strange pull, an unnatural compulsion to move closer, to understand the sound. Before she could stop herself, she knelt down in front of the cloaked figure, her eyes fixed on the person's hands. They were tapping their fingers against their knees, each tap ringing in the silence like the ticking of a clock. Mia opened her mouth to speak, the words caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of the figure's gaze on her, even though she couldn't see their eyes. It was as though the very air around them was charged with an unseen force, a presence that pushed her away, even as it drew her in. The tapping stopped suddenly. Mia's breath caught. She was paralyzed, unable to move, her body frozen in place by an overwhelming sense of terror. The figure's hands moved, and for the briefest moment, Mia saw something glint in the shadowed corner of the car. Something metallic, something sharp. The figure's hand reached out toward her, fingers curling in a slow, deliberate motion. And before she could react, the person spoke in a voice that was both chilling and strangely familiar. "Do you know why you're here?" The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, their meaning elusive, like an answer she couldn't quite grasp. The voice was soft, yet insistent. It felt like it was coming from somewhere deep inside her own mind. "I know," Mia whispered, her throat dry, her pulse pounding in her ears. "I don't understand." The figure's hand trembled slightly as it reached toward her, and for a brief moment, Mia thought it might touch her, might reach through the veil of fear that surrounded her. But instead, the cloaked figure pulled back, the tapping starting up again in a steady, rhythmic pattern. The sound was maddening, like the slow ticking of a clock counting down to something inevitable. The words echoed in Mia's mind. "Do you know why you're here?" A sudden crash interrupted her thoughts. The entire train lurched violently, throwing Mia forward against the seat in front of her. She cried out, her head colliding with the hard surface of the chair, sending sharp bursts of pain through her skull. The lights flickered and died, plunging the car into total darkness. Mia gasped, disoriented, her pulse racing. What was happening? Where was the conductor? Where was the train taking her? The train seemed to be slowing down, but something was wrong. The air was thick with the sound of something clawing, something desperate. And then she heard it. A low, guttural growl. It came from behind her, from the depths of the darkened train. The noise was deep, inhuman, like a creature waiting to pounce, its eyes fixed on her. And it was coming closer. The growl echoed through the car like a primal warning, reverberating off the walls and sending a ripple of cold terror crawling up Mia's spine. The air around her had turned thick and oppressive, heavy with something dark, something hungry. The silence was gone, replaced by the sinister hum of anticipation that hung like a fog in the space between each breath. The lights had completely failed. plunging the train into an impenetrable blackness, and Mia felt herself stiffen, every sense on high alert, as if the world around her had suddenly become a hunting ground. Her heart raced in her chest, a frantic beat that thudded like a drum, urging her to move, yet her body refused to obey. She stood frozen, her legs weak, her mind spinning with confusion. What was that sound? What was making it? She couldn't see a thing, but she felt its presence. Felt it growing closer, inch by inch, as if some invisible predator was drawing near. Her fingers fumbled for the nearest handhold, anything that could steady her in this nightmare. Her nails scraped against the cold metal of the train's interior, and for a moment she found herself wishing for the dim glow of the lights to return, just enough to see what was happening. Anything to make sense of the chaos. But then, in the suffocating silence, there was another noise. A clicking, like the sound of claws dragging across the metal floor. It was unmistakable. Her pulse quickened. She could hear it now, clear as day. It was close, too close. Something was moving through the train, and Mia knew. She knew it wasn't human. The growl came again, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to reverberate from the very core of the train. Mia's stomach twisted, and she staggered backward, her breath catching in her throat. Panic surged in her chest, and she suddenly realized the full extent of the danger she was in. This wasn't just a strange train. This wasn't some forgotten relic of a past long gone. This was a place where things hunted, where things waited, biding their time until the moment was right. She heard a hiss, sharp and guttural, followed by another scrape, this time closer than ever. Something was right beside her. Mia whirled around, her hands outstretched, desperate for any sign of light, any flicker of hope to pierce the darkness. But there was nothing. Nothing but the soft, tap-tap-tapping that seemed to come from every corner of the train at once, as though it were in her head, echoing in the spaces between her thoughts. In the oppressive darkness, she saw movement. Shadows, or at least what she thought were shadows, shifting unnaturally along the walls of the train. They weren't like any shadows she had seen before. These moved with a purpose, weaving in and out of the black void, constantly in motion, like animals stalking their prey. Mia took a step back, her breath shallow, her mind racing, trying to process what she was seeing, or what she thought she was seeing. Was it her mind playing tricks on her? Was she imagining this? The shadows, the tapping, the growls, they felt too real, too tangible to be a mere product of fear. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, no, a creature, emerged from the blackness. Its form was twisted, grotesque, a writhing mass of sharp angles and jagged edges. It was long, too long, its limbs stretching and shifting in unnatural ways as it skittered across the floor with a horrifying, jerky movement. Mia gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she stumbled backward, her legs giving out from under her. She fell hard, landing on the cold metal floor with a thud. The creature was closer now, its head twisted unnaturally to one side, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. But it wasn't the eyes that held her attention. It was the gaping mouth that hung open, wide and dripping, revealing rows upon rows of razor-sharp teeth that seemed to glisten with hunger. It let out a low, vibrating growl, a sound that seemed to come from deep within its chest, shaking the very air around them. Mia's breath hitched as she scrambled backward, her hands scraping along the floor. But the creature advanced with terrifying speed. Its legs were spindly and insect-like, and as it neared, it stopped, its head snapping up to meet her gaze. The growl subsided, replaced by a soft, guttural whisper, one that felt too familiar, too wrong. I see you. The words were barely audible, but they sent a chill rippling through Mia's body. She couldn't move, couldn't think. The world around her seemed to tilt as the creature's eyes fixed on hers with unnatural intensity, as though it could see deep into her soul. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the creature disappeared into the shadows again, leaving Mia trembling on the cold floor, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound of its claws clicking against the metal floor faded into the distance, but the unease in the air remained, stronger than ever. She was no longer alone on this train. She didn't know what these creatures were, but they were here, and they were hunting her. For the first time, Mia felt a terrible certainty sink in. She wasn't just on a train. She wasn't simply travelling from one place to another. She was caught in something far worse than she could have imagined. And the creatures weren't the only things she had to fear. The tapping began again, this time all around her from every direction. Soft at first, like a distant whisper, but then it grew louder, closer, until it was all-encompassing. It was coming from the passengers, the ones that had been silent, unmoving, their faces cold and hollow, now stirred. Slowly, imperceptibly, they began to shift, their bodies tilting in Mia's direction, their heads twisted unnaturally, like marionettes on broken strings, their eyes flicking to her with unblinking intensity. Mia froze, her blood running cold. The tapping intensified, a rhythmic, disturbing pattern that echoed through the train. It was a sound of warning, but it was too late. They were already moving. The passengers rose from their seats in unison, their movements stiff, mechanical. Their heads jerked toward her with unnatural speed, their mouths opening wide, their tongues flicking in and out like snakes, tasting the air. Their eyes burned with an unnatural hunger. They were no longer human. As they advanced, Mia tried to move, tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Panic surged through her veins as she watched them, these things, draw closer, their hollow eyes fixed on her with an insatiable, empty hunger. She knew with a sickening certainty that they were coming for her. They were the passengers, yes, but now they were something else entirely. And then in the midst of the growing chaos, the train lurched once again, throwing Mia forward, crashing her into the seat in front of her. The world around her spun wildly, and she gasped for breath, her vision blurring. Where was the conductor? The train jerked again, this time far more violently. The lights flickered, and in the flickering glow, Mia saw something, someone, standing at the front of the train. The figure was tall, shrouded in darkness, its form indistinct and indistinguishable from the night. It was watching her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't scream. The thing in the front of the train wasn't human either. It was the conductor, and it was coming for her. Mia's breath caught in her throat as the figure in the front of the train moved. It wasn't just walking, it was gliding, almost floating through the car toward her. Each step was deliberate, its shadowy presence growing larger, more menacing with every passing second. The flickering light seemed to strain under the weight of its form, casting the walls of the train in flashes of stark, unnatural light. And for a moment, the world around her shifted. The passengers, no longer even resembling human beings, had begun to move toward her as well. Their hollow eyes locked onto Mia's, their bodies jerking in spasmodic movements, like puppets whose strings had been pulled too tight. The tapping, once soft and rhythmic, had now become a cacophony, reverberating off the metal walls of the train like an endless drumbeat. She could hear it in her bones, feel it in her marrow, a sound that stirred something primal in her, a desperate need to escape, to run, to get away from whatever nightmare she had unwittingly become a part of. But her legs were useless. They wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, a passenger in her own personal hell. The conductor, or whatever this thing was nearing her now, its figure almost completely obscured in the swirling shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, its features vague and shifting like smoke, but Mia could feel its eyes on her. She couldn't see them, not directly, but they were there, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Every part of her screamed to run, but she could only stand there, frozen, unable to look away. It was like it was calling to her. "Do you know why you're here?" The voice, soft, familiar, came again, this time from the conductor's mouth, though it wasn't the voice she had heard earlier. This voice was deeper, more ancient, filled with an emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. The words echoed in her head, bouncing off the walls of her skull, demanding an answer she didn't have. Mia wanted to scream, wanted to shout, but her mouth wouldn't move, her throat constricting as though something invisible was choking her from the inside. The creatures, the passengers, had reached her now. They surrounded her, their faces twisted in grotesque expressions, their eyes burning with a sick, predatory hunger. The tapping had reached a fever pitch, and their hands twitched, fingers moving as if to touch her, to drag her into the depths of whatever horror they represented. She could feel their cold breath on her skin, hear the faintest rasp of their tongues slithering against their mouths. She closed her eyes, squeezing them shut in a vain attempt to block out the nightmare. But when she opened them again, they were gone. The train car was empty, no passengers, no creatures, no conductor, just the faint hum of the wheels on the tracks, the unsettling sound of the train racing through the darkness. Had it all been a dream? Was this some kind of twisted hallucination? But before she could process the thought, the train screeched to a sudden halt, throwing her violently forward, her body slamming into the cold metal floor with a sickening thud. The world around her spun, the lights flickering once more. Her vision blurred, and she could barely focus on the sight in front of her. A door. It was there, at the very end of the car, the final door that led to the unknown. The door was now wide open, and through it she could see a dim, unsettling light pouring in from beyond. Mia felt the pull of it, an undeniable force that seemed to beckon her forward. She was filled with an insatiable curiosity, a need to understand what lay on the other side. For the briefest moment, she stood there, unsure. The train had stopped. The world outside was waiting, but what was out there? What kind of reality was this, and could it be any worse than what she had just endured? Without thinking, Mia forced her legs to move. She stumbled forward, her body shaking as she approached the door. The creatures, the passengers, were gone. The conductor was gone. Only silence filled the train, a strange and eerie silence that seemed to stretch out forever. She stepped into the doorway. Outside, the world was not what she had expected. The landscape before her was a twisted, decaying version of a place she knew all too well, the train station where she had started this journey. The sky was a sickly grey, and the air was thick with an oppressive humidity that clung to her skin like sweat. The station was deserted, every bench and platform abandoned, as if time itself had been suspended in this place, caught in an endless loop. She stepped down onto the platform, her heart pounding with a combination of fear and relief. But as she glanced around, the sense of unease did not leave her. There was something wrong, something unnatural about the world around her. And then she saw it. A train, just like the one she had been on, was pulling into the station from the far end of the platform. It was identical to the ghostly train that had carried her through the terror-filled journey, the same black smoke billowing from its exhaust, the same darkened windows reflecting nothing but the void. The door opened and a figure stepped out from the shadows of the train. The conductor? But now his face was clear. Mia froze in place. His face was a twisted mockery of a human face, skin pale as bone, eyes hollow and dark like the void itself, lips cracked in a wide grin that stretched impossibly far. His mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and he spoke, his voice no longer soft, no longer familiar. "You're not free, Mia. You never were." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind from her chest. She staggered backward, feeling the ground beneath her shift, as though the very earth itself was swallowing her whole. The train, the station, the journey, it had all been leading to this. She tried to turn, to run, but the ground seemed to buckle beneath her, and she felt herself falling, her body plunging into the darkness. The scream that rose in her throat was silenced before it could escape. The void swallowed her whole, and then the train doors slammed shut. Mia's world went black. Somewhere in the dark, the sound of a train began to echo once again. It was the same train, it was always the same train, and there was always a new passenger waiting to board